The story of human civilization is more complex and more mysterious than we've been told. The paradigm of our reality could significantly change if we understood our past and who we used to be. These incredible cultures, the reason they were able to build these magnificent megalithic things that we have no idea how they moved them, how they carved them, any of these questions of how they did these things they did, they were mimicking. The more that I started digging into it, we may be looking at a completely different chapter of human civilization in which they knew things that even we don't know today, which is why I think most of the world doesn't know about these sites yet. There's like this underbelly of ancient knowledge that seems to have passed around the ancient world, then destroyed, but then preserved and protected in small little key pockets by different secret societies and other groups. And I was doing research and I stumbled across something very significant that actually may change this whole ballgame. This lost time period of human history.
Hey guys, if you're not subscribed, please smash that subscribe button and hit that like button on the video. And if you don't have time to watch this episode right now, no problem, but I'd really appreciate it if you would save it to your watch later playlist. Finally, if you'd like to follow me on Instagram and X, those links are in my description below. Thank you. LaCroix returns again. Welcome back, sir.
Hey Julian, it's good to be back again, my friend.
It's been a little bit. You've been around the world doing a lot of having a good time since the last time we talked.
Yeah, it's been a little over a year since we talked last time, and yeah, I've been to Turkey twice and then Peru. So it's been very exciting. It's been an incredible year.
Had you been in Peru before?
No, this is my first time actually getting on the ground to see the sites. I've been talking about it for a long time, but just like Turkey, I had been talking about that, but I hadn't been there as well. So now I have got those under my belt, and we certainly made some incredible discoveries. We got to see some private off-limits sites that were remarkable, and all the research and a lot of the things that I've talked about that we built up has really come to a different place now. It's quite exciting.
What makes it in a different place now?
Well, when you go to these locations, actually get a chance to investigate them, see them, you see a lot of things that you've never seen before. When you're looking online, you only have so much in front of you. You know, who's taking pictures of this, who's taking video of this, but what about the things that didn't get photographed or you didn't see? Things that you're there in person. Even just being there gives you a different experience of those locations. And for me, being there with a team of experts, you know, I just got back from Turkey on my second trip in early October with Dr. Robert Schoch.
Oh, you went with him?
Famous geologist, and we went with an archaeologist named Hans Orheim out of Sweden. We got a chance to go and scout out some of the locations that they need to see as well before we do filming this year, that we're going to be going and doing a whole team of experts is going to be going with me to film a lot of sites, including underwater, under Lake Vaughn.
Who's doing the underwater shots?
Well, we have a team of underwater divers that are going to be coming, and one of the things I can bring up is that the person who discovered the underwater ruins in 2017, and that's a great story I can tell. Please. Okay, well, his name is Tossin Salen, and he is a pretty famous underwater photographer and videographer.
And tell people where, just for people who haven't heard you in the past on this show, you've talked about Lake Vaughn, but just give them a layout of like where this is in Turkey and what the significance is.
A lot of the ancient world has these hot spots that people talk about, right? Everyone's talking about Göbekli Tepe over and over, right? Tarihan Tepe, but they're not talking about a lot of these newer places because they haven't hit the mainstream. It's not something that most people really know about, and the reason is that they're too new. For instance, the underwater Lake Vaughn discoveries that I'm referring to, that wasn't found until 2017. And so we're talking about very, very new discoveries that the world has not grasped yet. And the reason is that archaeologists have mislabeled them from, in my opinion, from the wrong time period, which has created a scenario where people are like, oh, well, that's not that interesting. It's, you know, it's from this time period, when really what we're looking at are places that are equally, if not older than Göbekli Tepe, in my opinion.
What are the archaeologists labeling on a time period scale
Lake Von, and what do you think it actually is?
So the Lake Von region was part of what's called the Urartian civilization that archaeologists are crediting for. And I obviously agree that was a major civilization in that region. That was around 2800 BC. Okay, so about 3,000 years ago. There was a civilization there that was during the same time as the Neo-Assyrian civilizations further south in ancient Mesopotamia, right? Ashurbanipal, Sennacherib. We've talked about them before. There was a competition going on over empires fighting during that time period, and they were being invaded constantly, and they were a war civilization. Now that group, the Urartians, is what archaeologists believe built all of these sites around not only Lake Von, but further east in Armenia and other locations. And we can talk about why they believe that and what we're getting into. But what really broke this open is that, getting back to what I was just referring to, Lake Von in eastern Turkey, it's one of the largest and deepest lakes on Earth. It's over 1,500 feet deep.
That's crazy.
It's unbelievable, right?
Lake.
I mean, Baikal in Siberia is the deepest, but this on a scale of others, it's unbelievable. I mean, it's deeper than most of the Great Lakes. It's very, very deep lake. And it has a very unique environment. It's what's known as a soda lake, an alkaline lake. And this actually can tie into a lot of the exciting news that we're going to get into, is because it's a soda lake, it creates an environment that preserves things underwater. And it has these massive type of structures from the salt formations that have created these incredible, almost like dreamlike environments of these towers underwater.
What's the science there? Why does that preserve it? My head would immediately think that it would do the opposite, but why does it not?
If you get a lake that has river outlets, you get a current flowing through it, you're going to get moving water, you're going to get moving sediments, you're going to get an environment underwater that is more volatile, okay? When you have an alkaline environment, it doesn't create a scenario where there is as much acidification to like breaking down of materials underwater. It actually creates a preservation type of quality. And that is what we're finding in Lake Von. It's the best example in the world of a soda alkaline lake. There's no better example than that. And because of that, it's created this preservation underwater. Again, as I say, these giant towers of basically alkaline, like calcified environments that have formed because of the amount of sodium. There's only one fish that lives in the entire lake. It's called a pearl mullet.
They only have one fish?
Only one fish lives in the entire lake. There's nothing else.
There's no other life.
There's some small little shrimp-like creatures and some types of insects, but there's no other fish that live in the entire lake. It's a very unusual type of scenario. And that's what leads to what I'm about to tell you, is that this wasn't even an archaeologist. There's a famous videographer, underwater photographer, Tausen Salen, who travels all over the world. Yeah, Tahsin, Tausen Salen, Seylan.
And Lake Von.
And he primarily does underwater ocean photography in the Red Sea and off of Egypt and other places around the world. He's actually quite popular, and he's been in a number of different high-level type of documentaries and others. Well, he came to Turkey. Well, he lives in Turkey, but he came to Lake Von because he wanted to photograph the underwater microinvertebrate type of environments underwater and the life. It's a beautiful lake. I mean, Lake Von is surrounded by the Taurus Mountains to the south and this huge mountain volcano to the north called Sufan Mountain that's over 13,000 feet high. Huge volcano. And because it's surrounded by giant mountains and it's this huge kind of crystalline lake, it's beautiful. It's got like blue water because of the salt. The lake literally looks blue. I got a chance to go swim in it.
You did? I was going to ask you that.
Yeah.
What was that like?
I went down with Robert Schoch and my girlfriend Jenny and Hans, and we got a chance to swim in it. It's one of the most beautiful lakes I've ever seen, and I've hiked and traveled to a lot of beautiful lakes in the world. But I have to say, Lake Von is arguably one of the most beautiful lakes I've ever been to.
And there's only one type of fish in it, so it's almost like swimming through like a freshwater pond, but it's 1,600 meters deep or whatever.
In fact, there's arguments that they may have never found the true depth of the lake, because I was talking to fishermen there and our tour
Fishermen?
guide, who have depth sounded the lake. They catch those pearl mullet in nets. Yeah, there's tossing, and you can see
So
the
there's like
underwater
a
stuff.
lot of them. There's a lot
there's
of
a
these pearl-
huge schools of
got it,
them,
got it.
but it's the only fish in the lake. So you can see like the image of the underwater stuff under Lake Vaughn. That's Tossin.
Now, so Towson's swimming there, and I can see it looks like he has a light up above that. Do you know like how deep he got for something like this?
And that's that's the big part of what we're going to get into is the depth. That's actually a really big part of this. It's important. So Tossin is photographing in different parts of the lake, okay? He's doing photography of the migrations of the pearl mullets in the spring when they spawn, right? They flood the rivers and they're like jumping all over the place. It's quite a spectacle. The pearl mullets are not, they're not more than a foot long, but they're huge schools of them in the lake, okay? So he's photographing that as a nature documentary, but he's also photographing and filming the underwater areas, which, by the way, there's been very little done under Lake Vaughn. It's a very mysterious lake. So he's filming off of Actomar Island and in these different areas, and there are a number of different ruins that are known about under Lake Vaughn, but they're shallow. Well, he's diving off of a place called Ajijivez, which is in the northern part of Lake Vaughn in 2017. And you can only dive in the lake for the first 2 hours in the morning. Because once you get into the afternoon, the sunlight reflects off of all the salt and makes it so you can almost not even see underwater. So you have this small window where you can actually dive. Okay, so he's diving off of Ajijivez, which is right adjacent to Kef Kalesi, an ancient megalithic site that I talked about on some of the other shows, and I've subsequently gone to, and we can talk about that as well. So he's diving off of that, and there are ruins down near the edge of the shoreline, but there had never been anything done out underwater. So he's underwater and he's diving, and he gets down to 75 feet underwater. 75 feet underwater. Unbelievably deep area, which, by the way, there's no underwater ruins in the world that are found at that depth. Anywhere in the world, yes. If you go off of, for instance, there are underwater ruins in Lake Titicaca.
Yeah.
They're 20, 30 feet at max.
You're just talking about for lakes, though.
No, in oceans included.
What about the ruins that are off the coast of Cuba?
Well, that's not okay. Hold on. We'll pause there for a second.
Okay.
That may exist, and there is a lot of evidence that supports that it does exist.
Interesting.
But we don't have enough evidence yet, and I talked about that last time we were on.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember the context because I just had NEXT in here. We had a long little segment in there where he was going through whether or not that could be true or not. So I couldn't remember the evidence, but
it's too deep for that. Those ruins off of Cuba are too deep for an actual diver to go to. Right, they're 2,000 feet underwater, which means you need a submersible to get down there and look at them. Now, that's a whole
Titanic situation,
right? That's a whole argument in itself of whether or not that's real, and I've talked about that before on episodes. It is very interesting. More exploration is needed to completely confirm that.
Chaz, do your balls ever stink?
Yes.
Mine do too. Sometimes you get sweaty and then you got to do stuff the rest of the day. You're running around and that stench kind of creeps up and suddenly you're thinking, maybe that's going beyond my nostrils. And guess what? Sometimes it is. That's why we have Mando.
Mando?
Yeah. Yeah, they're sponsoring us now. They're fire, bro. You use this?
Yeah.
Let's go. Let's go. See, we got people in the peanut gallery who use it. Mando's whole body deodorant is safe to use anywhere on your body. Pits, balls, thigh folds, belly buttons, butt cracks, and feet. And you know that this is a trustworthy product because a doctor made it, and they've never been wrong before. Never, ever. Now, the doctor who made Mando saw firsthand how normal BO was being misdiagnosed and mistreated. So he made a product clinically proven to block odor all day and control odor for up to 72 hours. That's pretty nuts. And besides the whole body deodorant, you have some other options too. There's the solid deodorant stick, formulated and powered by mandelic acid to stop odor before it starts. And then there's the spray deodorant, aluminum free and ideal for hard to reach places. If you've never used Mando before, then I got good news for you. you today because Mando's starter pack is the best possible thing you can get right up front. It comes with a solid stick deodorant, cream tube deodorant, 2 free products of your choice, like mini body wash and deodorant wipes, and oh yeah, free shipping. As a special offer for our listeners today, you're going to get $5 off a starter pack using our exclusive code, which by the way equates to over 40% of your starter pack. So use code Julian at shopmando.com, shopmando.com, link in description below, and you'll get that $5 off, and you'll also support our show if you tell them we sent you. Once again, that's code Julian at shopmando.com. Smell fresher, stay drier, and boost your confidence from head to toe with Mando.
But in terms of confirmations, a place that like divers can get to and see that has been confirmed, these are by far, without a doubt, the deepest ruins anywhere in the world.
See, I don't want to make it sound less. 75, sometimes I fuck feet in meters, so sorry if I did that earlier.
It would be about 23 meters.
So 75 feet underground or down below is obviously deep. I don't want to make that sound like it's not deep. That doesn't sound like the deepest we'd ever find. Like, that doesn't seem that deep for the deepest we'd ever find some ancient history artifacts.
Well, think about this for a minute. So the underwater ruins off of Alexandria, Egypt, and off of Greece, they're near the shoreline.
Yes.
Right? They're not, we've never found any that are a greater depth than that. And I'm going to give you some examples. I'm not saying there has never been ruins that are deeper considering ocean level increases after the Younger Dryas.
Yes.
Right? You get 400 feet increase in ocean levels around a lot of parts of the earth. I'm sure there were underwater ruins, but they were never found or they were destroyed.
To be clear, you're saying ruins. That doesn't necessarily include like artifacts, though.
No, I'm talking about actual substantial ruins of a civilization.
Okay, that makes sense. Because I was going to say, like the Antikythera mechanism that was found, the old 2,000-year computer, I believe that was found in the Mediterranean.
But those
that had
things
to be
can
deeper.
sink from a shipwreck or something.
That's right.
Okay,
exactly.
so we're talking about
now we're on the same page.
Ruins, extensive ruins,
Yes.
megalithic blocks. And that's the other part of this. Even the ruins that have been found in the world, they weren't megalithic. So megalithic meaning large, finely cut blocks put together, like precise, like we see in Lake Vaughan area that I've talked about before. We see in Peru, Bolivia, and Egypt. Highly precise, ancient work. This not only is the only underwater megaliths in the world, but it's the deepest ruins anywhere in the world.
And this guy just stumbled upon it.
So he was diving off of a Gigivez, and he completely randomly found them.
What did he think? Have you talked with him about this?
I've talked with him. He's actually on the team. He's on the documentary team. I'm working directly with him, and he's going to be leading us when we film at the end of June, early July to the ruins to go.
What did he think it was when he first stumbled upon it?
He saw it was the underwater ruins of a castle, they called it, and he reported it to, and I can tell you the story after, but he reported it to the institutions and the Turkish government, and they didn't believe him.
Did he show him the picture?
And so he's like, look at all the pictures. And then he basically had it published in different magazines, and it got some attention, but not nearly enough attention because it was labeled as being like a Urartian or a medieval later time period. But we can get into how not only is that grossly wrong, but this could be one of the better examples of dating evidence of anywhere in the world.
And why is that, and what is our evidence for it?
So 75 feet is a very, very deep depth. For the first question you'd have to ask is, how could a lake fluctuate by that much? This isn't the ocean. Okay. We're talking about a lake that's a long way from the ocean. How could you have depths fluctuate 80 to 100 feet? Because obviously, if it's found at 75 feet underwater, they would have had to have been substantially less for a civilization to build on the edge of it. They're not going to build with the waves lapping up against it, right? That wouldn't make sense. They would have to build, at least a little ways away from the edge of the shoreline. But so that would have to mean that the lake was at least 80, if not 100 feet lower when they built it. Okay? Mm-hmm. Now that creates a number of problems. It creates a number of problems because when you look at historic lake levels of Lake Vaughan, there is nothing within the last 12,000 years that can account for the levels of that lake being that low. It creates a very interesting scenario where we may have the next best piece of evidence we have besides the weathering on the Sphinx that Robert Schoch had identified, which is, a big part of this because Robert Schoch is on the team.
Yeah,
and
that's amazing.
We're going to call him an independent objective researcher on the team who is investigating these sites. I don't want to put him under the category of he already has a predetermined conclusion for this. I want to be very clear. He's an objective scientist exploring these sites with us.
That's important.
Yes. So it doesn't mean any predetermined hypothesis or conclusions have already been determined. We are investigating anomalies and ancient ruins to determine whether or not they may be from a much earlier time period. Okay?
Got it.
So Tossin is underwater. He finds this extremely extensive area of megalithic ruins. It's over a kilometer in area. Huge.
Whoa.
This is not just like...
It's like a town.
Well, let me tell you why that's important. One of the considerations from geologists are like, well, what if this was a set of ruins on the shoreline that like slid into the lake? That's actually a hypothesis that's been considered. If you have a geologic area of instability on the shoreline, you could get a landslide where it sinks into the lake.
How far into it was it though? Like how
it's
far?
over half a mile from the shore. Now
so that's not. I'm not an expert.
Well,
on
no,
how this
because
stuff
it's over a
happens.
kilometer wide. You can't. You would have to have like a small area sink in. You couldn't have like an entire, almost a mile. Of
to the
ruins.
common sense, that seems crazy. I agree.
Right. So he goes and he tells the Turkish government they didn't believe him at first. How could that be possible? 75 feet underwater to have extensive megalithic ruins of blocks that are over in some cases, over a foot wide. These are massive megalithic blocks that are very finely cut and put together. So that's the first thing to pay attention to. Now, the second thing is that they're not built out of what the Urartians built with. So the Urartians built with limestone blocks. That's what I've postulated and talked about, is that the tools available, Iron Age and Bronze Age tools, would never be able to manipulate a harder stone. That's one of the arguments for the documentary and we're talking about, because we see basalt, giant basalt blocks like at Kef Kalesi and others that are finely carved, and then we see limestone associated with it. Now, the blocks underwater would never have been able to survive if they were limestone. They would get eaten away by the acidification or by the underwater, by the salt. It would have been able to survive, but that's why we believe they're basalt. And that creates a whole nother animal itself, because it adds in, well, how were they created? Were they from what I'm considering is an earlier time period is one of the arguments.
So we haven't been able to take some sort of like sedimentary sample of this and
no
test
sampling has been done yet. So
why not?
Well, Tossin dove down he's a photographer.
Yeah.
He didn't even have an archaeologist.
I know, but this is 2017. It's been 8 years.
Yeah, nothing's happened since.
So no one's going down there.
No. We're going to be the first team of experts in the world that has ever gone down to analyze, study it, and potentially take samples if we get permits. We have to...
If you get permits, how does that work?
Well, we're going to be... We're applying and we're working on getting all the permits necessary. That shouldn't be an issue. We're going to be doing this in a completely scientific way. We're not going to disturb anything. We're not going to touch anything. We're not going to cause any damage to the environment around it. We're simply going to be photographing and analyzing and investigating these and looking at them to potentially see that they may be from a completely lost time period of human civilization. And that because they're such an anomaly, again, you can't see that anywhere else in the world, it gives us a couple really unique type of opportunities. The first is that the sediments have been relatively undisturbed. So we have a chance to see something that has not been touched, that has not really been altered by anything, and really get a chance to review it. The second thing, and we'll get into the symbols that are on some of the stones, but I want to bring up a really significant part of this that I think is significant to dating evidence that we don't have. So when a lot of people wish be easy enough we could date a lot of these structures around the world. The argument is that, well, is there a lost time period of human civilization around the world in which a culture that no longer exists built giant megalithic structures and temples all across the planet that was wiped out during the catastrophes during the last ice age of the Younger Dryas, right?
Which is what, like 11,000 some
11,600 years ago or so. And that's the argument that a lot of, you call them alternative researchers, have postulated and put forth.
Yeah.
And, you've talked to others a lot. We've talked about it. Robert Schoch was brought into the Sphinx enclosure because John Anthony West saw what he believed and other experts had believed was water weathering and not wind erosion, right?
Yes.
And that was one of the arguments put forth that, look, the Sphinx was actually built by an earlier culture before the dynastic Egyptians because it's water erosion and Egypt hasn't had any rain. And that's substantial enough in the last 12,000 years.
Yeah.
So there's already this position, and Graham Hancock did a great job with his Netflix series, season 1 and 2 of Ancient Apocalypse. I don't know if you've seen it yet.
I've seen a lot of season 1.
He did a great job. I give him props for that. Thank you for laying that foundation down. Randall Carlson, Graham Hancock, John Anthony West, Robert Schoch, Robert Bavall. There's so many names that I could say. Props to all of you guys. Thank you so much for laying such a great foundation down of us exploring what potentially could be a much earlier and sophisticated and lost time period of human history.
Has it hit you yet that someone like you, who's been a real student of the game for so many years, who wanted to learn more, just started with your own curiosity and worked your way into being an expert, that now you are potentially sitting here on the precipice of being able to go in with an official team that you're in charge of to do an excavation of sorts on something that could change the way we view a certain part of history in really towards the middle of the earth right there?
Yeah, I feel extremely blessed, very, very, very appreciative that I have been able to take a lot of this research and a lot of this passion and that I've done in writing to a completely different level. One that's frankly, has never been done. We've never had a team of academics and top experts in their field truly go in and investigate these in a scientific, objective way to finally create something where we can say, look, we have evidence to support that this lost human chapter of human civilization is real and that it has been overlooked. And has been something that the narrative needs to strongly consider, is that the story of human civilization is more complex and more mysterious than we've been told.
Now, when you get down there, what are you most looking for? Like, what are the top 3-ish type things that you're going to be trying to identify?
So what we're going to be doing is we are going to be identifying the type of stone that has been used to build these. That's a really, really big deal. Again, it gets back to understanding the Mohs hardness scale. If you have stone that is of a hardness of 6 or 7, which is basalt, it's a type of volcanic stone, the tools you have available for a civilization and the capabilities of that civilization come in, they matter. They really come into hand because it's not that easy just to create a giant megalithic temple. The amount of work and people involved and calculations and everything involved is not simple. It's a great undertaking, and you have to have a civilization that has reached a certain level to be able to do that. It's not easy. It's a nomadic tribe of hunter-gatherers or primitive kind of warlike people would not be able to create great works of art through stone, because it is art. It's beautiful to create stones that are so tightly fit together that you can't even put a piece of paper between them.
It's incredible.
And then carve seamlessly beautiful, beautiful motifs and symbols into them, even cross-fitting on the stones between them.
Cross-fitting on the stones?
Cutting it, this is another fascinating aspect of this, is that Ionis, one of the sites, Ionis Kalesi on the banks of Lake Vaughan, has symbols carved between the stone fitting. So, which is wild to think about. So if you're carving with a chisel and you're like, and you're trying to put that in, how would you seamlessly carve with razor sharp edges, almost laser-like cuts, seamlessly between two blocks that fit together? How would you do that?
With a chisel? I don't see the possibility there.
That's the problem, is at these sites, especially Ionis, we see this extremely fine andesite basalt stonework that is, again, beautiful. Some of the arguably some of the finest megaliths in the world in terms of how they're polished and put together and seamless. And in that way, we see these where the fittings are, where the blocks come together very, very precisely. There are symbols carved right between that overlaps where the blocks come together in a completely seamless way. So when you look at, I don't know if Alessi can pull something up. Can you look up Ionis Kalesi for me? I can show you an example of this.
Oh, yeah, please. I was just going to ask. Curious what this looks like.
Yeah. Ayanis. And then Kalesi, Kalesi. Yeah.
Okay.
It'll be, you'll be able to find it, and I'll give you some. I just want to give some examples of this as we're talking about it, because I think it really is easily the one right in the center, right down, right to the left, right there. By the way, that's me on the one in the picture to the right of you. See that?
I did not see that. Can we zoom in on that, Alyssa?
This is a perfect example. Now scroll above the altar and go right into the cross.
Yes.
Go right in there tight. Right in there.
That's the best we got.
Okay. So take a look at these symbols carved in. You can see a griffin on the left. You can see some of the symbols of Haldi and then some of the crosses.
The pine cone type
Right,
figure.
right.
Yeah.
Now look at how the symbols are carved between the blocks fitting together. It's to do that.
Oh.
And they're so seamless that they're not even off fitted. Like they're not even like off by
They're not. It's
by
like
a centimeter.
Yeah.
How would you do that with modern tools or ancient tools, I should say? How would you be able to seamlessly cut these symbols out of, by the way, one of the hardest stone on earth? This is what's called andesite. It's even harder than basalt. They're both volcanic, but andesite is a type of metamorphosized volcanic rock that is a 7.5 on the Mohs hardness scale out of 10. One of the hardest stones on earth. Look at how precisely these symbols are carved. And by the way, that is what's called the sun cross in the center, which becomes the Knights Templar cross and the red cross we see in the night. We've talked about it in the Vatican and others, which is very peculiar. But that's what I'm talking about is on the left side, you can see what I think is like an hourglass figure next to the Griffin. Those symbols are carved seamlessly into blocks that are fitted together. Now, the only way to do that in my mind is if and hit back once, you can see a couple other examples, but the only way you could do that is to have the blocks already put together and then carve it into them, right? Because if you were to carve two symbols into blocks like that, how would you then fit them together to have them aligned perfectly? Right? It wouldn't.
It would be too hard.
It would be too difficult, and so.
Yeah, I mean, we can. This picture right here is so like HD. You can see it even better.
And look at the Griffin on that one block.
Yeah, the
right?
lining is insane.
So that's what we're talking about. Is number one, how could an Iron Age? The Urartians were an Iron Age civilization, which they only had Iron Age tools available to them. 2800 BC. How would they have been able to cut and create symbols out of that kind of stone? Which, by the way, we don't even know where. Some of these quarries, geologists have identified some of the quarries where these blocks came from. Mm-hmm. Some of them are over 200 miles away. One of them is speculated to be 400 miles away.
Whoa! Because
of the type of basalt and andesite, it's insane how we don't even know how they moved them. But then once they put them in place, how could they get seamless symbols and motifs cut out of them? You know what it looks like? People have told me. It looks like almost like cookie cutters.
Yes.
So like if you like
exactly
a 3D printer or something, right? If you had something that was like you stick it right in, whoop, it's like clay or something, and then it comes out. Now that brings up the question of whether or not these rocks were superheated.
That's what I was going to ask. So
right.
if they do that and they're so massive, like obviously if they're heated at that kind of level, it's like if you touch it, you're going to burn.
It's mysterious. If anything, it would be to the point where I don't even know outside of laser type of tools if we could even do this today. With that kind of precision, a stonemason, like give me an example. There have been stonemasons that have brought into Tiwanaku in Pumapunku in Bolivia, which also has laser-like cut edges and symbols, just very similar to this. In fact, we're going to talk about a lot of parallels to that today. They've been brought into that, and they're like, I couldn't do this. I don't know any stonemason that could do this by hand. Maybe with some kind of a technology, like some kind of a laser-like technology. But it brings up the question is, if we could barely do it or not do it, how could an Iron Age civilization from 2800 BC do this? And that's really where the question comes in. And I want to, Alessi, can you go back once? I just want to show another example before we move on to get to some other stuff. Okay, right there. Just leave it there for a minute. Now, we've talked about this before, but I want to bring it up one more time. All of that brown dirt you see on top of the andesite.
And for people listening, not watching, we're back on the original image we had of all the same crosses that are carved into this.
That is not actually dirt. All of the brown material above the stone is actually eroded mud brick. Okay?
Mud brick?
Mud brick. So the Urartians primarily build out of what's called mud brick, where they would take mud and types of soil material, and they would basically create bricks out of them, let them sit out in the sun, they harden, right? And then they would build with them. And none of that is actually dirt. It's eroded mud brick. Now, if they built 2,800 years ago with the mud brick and it eroded to that level, imagine those blocks being in that level of being precise still and not eroded. Imagine the difference there, first of all.
Oh, yeah.
Now, archaeologists claim that this is a building style. And I would agree, it is a style some places around the world. A culture, or even today, you'll see Roman Greco and other things where they build out of stone and they have something more lighter on top because you need a foundation that is stronger, okay? That's the argument that they use, that the Urartians built with stonework on the bottom and then mud brick above it on top. Because these were all incorporated into castles. That's what the word Kalesi means. They're castles. And they were castles, but that doesn't mean they originally were castles. Okay, that's the thing that really needs to come across here, is that any civilization we see around the world adopts ancient sites. They know it's important. They often will incorporate symbols into their culture from another ancient site. We see it all around the world. They'll adopt a site and then build right on top of it. It happens all the time. The Romans are famous for building on top of older foundations of structures. We see that in Baalbek, Lebanon all the time. So what is being laid out right now is that archaeologists are saying the Urartians built this unbelievable andesite on the bottom with these stonework and then built primitive mud brick right on top of it. And that's where it was everywhere. But the problem is that it doesn't really make sense. And the only reason why they're saying that is because there's cuneiform writing written into some areas of these temples and these structures. Cuneiform. So we see the wedge-like cuneiform design into the outer part of Ionis when you first come in. However, that's the only piece of evidence, and there's no other evidence they're using to back it up. Because if you translate this Urartian cuneiform, it talks about rulers like Rusa II and other rulers who wrote in this temple was built, or they don't even say they built it. They just say this temple is built in honor or whatever it is. But they don't say anything about the original foundations or anything. But they claim ownership of these sites, okay? And for a certain dynasty or time period. That is the only evidence that archaeologists are using to say who built it, is the cuneiform, except there's a problem. Throughout Egypt, we have evidence from say, the Ramsey culture and other dynastic Egyptians that they would write and carve hieroglyphics into other existing structures and claim ownership for them, right? That's one of the arguments for the Sphinx, is that it was recarved and it was originally not the same head. Well, that's the same problem we have here, is that the Urartians, and it's a thing that is very common in the ancient world, is trying to take credit for something because you want to seem greater and more majestic. And I postulate that all the cuneiform, all of it, is from the Urartians, and that this mysterious civilization that built this left no writings at all behind. None. We see the same thing in Egypt, is there's no writings left behind from the builders of the Great Pyramid of Giza.
Yeah.
There's
I
no
just had Luke
writings.
Caverns in here going through a bunch of that timeline. It's crazy.
There's no writings anywhere inside the Great Pyramid at all. There's something scribbled that is supposedly scribbled with Khufu's name that is very likely a forgery that's been talked about from the 1800s. It's a whole story that you can get into, but there's no writings anywhere in any of those. In fact, most megalithic structures around the world, for instance, Peru and Bolivia, there's no writings in any of the megaliths anywhere there. It just got back from Peru. There's not one place where there's writings like in it, okay? Same with Egypt. The blocks don't have writings. So here we have beautiful megalithic work around Lake Vaughan with writings that are sporadic in a couple places, but most of them have nothing on them. And so the argument that I'm putting forth is that the Urartians came forward and had a warlike culture, and they were fighting the Assyrians like crazy back and forth. They, through their own wanting to be a superior civilization and showing their dominance, they put their names and they took credit for an earlier civilization that built these and then put their cuneiform into it.
So that's where we get like they build the castle on top of what
exactly.
Yeah.
And then they incorporate the existing structures into their culture. Whereas if we look at the capabilities of the Urartians through their art, pottery, what they were doing, they severely lacked any of the capability in my mind. It's from everything I've studied and other archaeologists have put forth and have talked about as well, is that it doesn't match any of their other building styles. You can see other Urartian building styles with crude stonework and mud brick, and it doesn't match that time period at all. It just doesn't.
So it's an outlier, and there would have to be something unforeseen in the capabilities of their civilization or in the stylistic culture or whatever of their civilization for this to actually be attributed to them completely from where the base was.
If you take out the cuneiform, there's no evidence that the Urartians built it at all.
Okay.
None. And so that's where we get into is whether or not they just carved cuneiform into some of these structures to take credit for them, like Shavus Tepe, like Ionis. We see a lot of examples of that around the world, as I said, of cultures adopting and trying to take ownership of something that they didn't actually build.
Sure.
Now, let's get back to Lake Vaughan.
Yes, because I originally opened up this tangent with asking about the main, 3-5 things, whatever it is, that you're going to be looking for going down there.
So the stonework.
Yep.
All right, that was a long
a good tangent. I like that.
Tangent to talk about the stonework. When you go down under Lake Vaughan, you see highly precise stonework, just like we see above the water at Ionis, Shavus Tepe, Kefkalesi, Asverna Tepe, Toprakal, all their other sites where you see beautiful, beautiful stonework at the bases of these with basalt and andesite where it's finely cut and polished. And we see the same thing underwater, okay? And that's the first thing we bring up is that it has the same kind of architecture. Now, the big thing about the next piece of evidence I want to bring up is for dating. And then we can talk about the symbols that are carved into the stone.
Yes, we'll get there.
I think that the dating potential under Lake Vaughan creates a scenario that is unusual anywhere in the world. The first thing is that you can't date stone above water. It gets extremely affected by the environment of weathering and other environments. The only reason Göbekli Tepe was able to be dated is because it was buried.
Yes, buried.
Okay, so then they were able to go in and carbon date the organic material in the cracks of that. Now, some of that could be possible at some of these sites if they do it right, because we have evidence that Kefkalesi and Ionis was buried as well. Evidence that the Urartians buried it because they were being invaded and it was being potentially going to be destroyed by other cultures, and they knew it was important. And so, like, Ionis was a giant hillside mound on top, and they found evidence that not only was it either deliberately basically it was like a castle on top, that it was not broken in, but basically collapsed in on itself, and then buried on top of that with a very thick layer up to 5 or sometimes even 10 feet of material that was then put on top. So the amount of work necessary to bury these would have been enormous, but you would have done that if you wanted to preserve them. So that is what we've found, is that possibly could be another avenue, is some of the soil and some of the dating done on this. And I'm in talks with Robert Schoch on whether or not that's something we're going to be pursuing with some of these sites as well.
And because it's in the lake, you can actually do it in a more verifiable way.
You have but the potential of soil sampling, core sampling of soil, that is different with an undisturbed underwater situation than you do above ground. And so that's something that's possible in the future. But let me bring up the big one here. There's a big one. Again, how do you date any of this then, besides what I just said? You don't get much more than that. You get some types of organic dating if you have it available based on the scenario. And then there's like vitrification of melting of rock that we identified. That's another possibility to do some dating on. But the big one is this. So as I mentioned, this underwater ruins of Lake Vaughan are 75 feet underwater, which means that Lake Vaughan would have had to fluctuate at least 80 feet to be able to have these exposed above water. Now, Lake Vaughan is what's called a closed basin system, meaning that it doesn't have any rivers that leave it. Okay, so it has rivers coming in and then nothing leaves. The only way that water can leave the lake is through evaporational cooling. There's no other way.
because of the flow of the rivers,
Yeah.
you're saying.
And so, but the problem is that it wasn't always like that. Lake Vaughan used to have a river that exited it. In the southwest part of the river, there's a river called the Murat River, M-U-R-A-T, that used to exit the lake, and it was the only river that exited the lake. Now, if you imagine climatically in the last 12,000 years, if you're going to try to discuss how a lake can fluctuate its water levels, you would be like, oh, well, it went through different periods of rain and then less rain and less snow, right? And then dry periods. Well, that would only be able to fluctuate the lake a few hundred meters at most, right? Feet, not 80 feet. That would be something beyond any kind of mega drought to be able to do something like that, especially in a region that doesn't have those kinds of droughts. So I was doing research and I stumbled across something very significant that actually may change this whole ballgame. And I think it's one of the ways that we could have some what you call a smoking gun piece of evidence.
And what is that?
That joins Robert Schoch's and John Anthony West's water weathering of the Sphinx enclosure. When you look at historic records of Lake Vaughan, there's an anomaly you can find. There's a volcano on the southwest part of Lake Vaughan called Mount Nemrut, not to be confused with the other Mount Nemrut that's more in central Turkey. It is one of the largest volcanic calderas in the world. It's enormous. And in fact, Alexander the Great, when he traveled to that region, they visited that and they talked about it. Xerxes the Great visited this region too. It was an ancient region. We've talked about the biblical connections to the sons of Noah and this whole Ararat civilization thing that may tie into this mysterious civilization. So other cultures were coming here as tourists to see it. In fact, in Vaughan, there's a inscription carved out of the stone in a place called Tuspa, the castle in Vaughan, from Xerxes the Great. That's in that. So they were visiting this place. Anyway, in the southwest part of the lake, as I mentioned, is a massive volcano that has an eruption that was so big that it altered that entire region. Literally, the entire mountain blew up.
Hey guys, if you haven't already subscribed, please hit that subscribe button. It's a huge, huge help. Thank you.
And it has a volcanic crater, a caldera that is miles across. It's enormous. Now, when you look at data of this volcano, you find out that it's been extremely studied because it's one of the better calderas in the world, the bigger and more older and more well studied. And so you look at the dating and they've gone in, they've done cores into the volcano and they've studied the hell out of it. So we have a bunch of data from the volcano, which is interesting because it gives us the scientific evidence we need to help potentially prove the dating of this civilization. Let me tell you why. When you look into the records of what they found with this volcano is they found out that the volcano has had its last major eruption. So the one where it blew its top off, right, and scattered stuff all over Vaughan, happened right at the end of the Younger Dryas.
Ooh, convenient.
Right at the end of the Younger Dryas, around 11,000 to 12,000 years ago, somewhere in there, 12, maybe 13, somewhere in that time period, the Younger Dryas, okay? So they know that that's when it last had its major eruption. There has been little minor ones since then, but usually volcanoes kind of burp a little bit over time, but not a major one.
Yep.
So what happened was you find out that they have great geologic records of this, that when Mount Nemrut exploded, its debris, because it's right next to the Meerut River. The Meerut River is only a couple miles away, blocked off the access outlet of the Meerut River from Lake Vaughan, the only river that exits Lake Vaughan, blocking it off and basically completely separating it from the lake, creating a closed basin system where no water could leave Lake Vaughan again. Now, if you have a bathtub, I'm going to give the bathtub analogy, and you are filling the bathtub with water, meaning rivers coming in, right? Because there's big rivers that flow into Lake Vaughan, and you have a plug that's partially open. You're going to have the water come in, but some leaves. So you're going to have a somewhat consistent level of water that fluctuates a little bit, right? Based on how much you put in, but some's always going to leave. That's how lakes work, right? That's how you fluctuate the lake. What happens if you plug it up? Boom, you put the plug in. What happens? It all of a sudden fills up with an enormous amount, doesn't it? Well, how else could you account for 80 to 100 feet of lake depth change
That could do it.
to then flood over ancient civilization ruins and then put it somewhere? You now have dating from a geologic event that occurred that specifically blocks off the only outlet that would have allowed water to leave, keeping a steady flow in that lake, to then flood it over. And you have geologic dating proving when that event occurs.
Which means that this is older than that event.
Exactly.
Wow.
Which means that we now have what may be the best tangible evidence, or some of the best we've ever had, to prove that these are lost civilization evidence before the Younger Dryas.
How old again do they say Göbekli Tepe is?
11,800 years old.
Okay, so also right in that
Right in
zone.
that time period. But that's the dating they get. It may be older than that. It just means that
Based
that's
on
the
what?
organic. Well, it means that that's the age of the organic matter that was on that crevice. It doesn't mean that that's when the stones were built. You see what I'm saying? That's like saying, well, we know it's at least 11,800 years old, because you can't date stone. So you're like, just like we're saying here, well, we know this geologic event happened where it blocked off the Meerut River and then raised Lake Vaughan, flooding over this ruins. We know it's at least 12,000 years old.
Yes, but it could be way older.
Exactly. Okay. Exactly. It could be way older than that. So this is very exciting, because we have scientific evidence now that is very extensive, that is really adding up to a smoking gun potentially of changing this entire narrative.
And so you have to get the permits and everything. When are you looking to do this?
We're going to be diving down with Towson, who is the one who discovered these underwater ruins. We're going to be going with a whole team at the end of June, early July.
That's coming up. And what was the other thing you said you hinted at you were going to be looking for is the symbolism on the rocks, right?
Yeah, one of the things that he found when he went down there is that not only does it have the same type of stonework and the type of stone that is important to understand, but there is a very set of prominent symbols carved into the top of these blocks, and that is the flower of life. This giant six-figured spoked, I'll call them spokes, flower of life, which is very important, that number of spokes, because it's going to tie into numerology and this motif around the world that we're going to talk about, and symbols that connect to all the stuff above that we're going to get into as well.
And for people who aren't familiar, who haven't heard on previous podcasts and stuff, can you explain the flower of life and what that is and what its history is?
So the flower of life is a type of symbol that has been used by ancient cultures throughout history. It's one of the most common motif symbols we find. I think that one of the best examples for it we can see in ancient times is if we go to the Osirion in Abydos, Egypt. And in the Osirion is this massive subterranean area that is built out of these huge granite columns that are many, many multi-ton granite columns that is a very mysterious place, because there's primitive limestone built above it, just like we talked about with different cultures building on top of older existing things. And down in the Osirion, you can see these numerous patterns that have been carved into the rock of this six-spoked flower of life. Now, why six? Well, the flower of life is basically the way that you would embody and show the intelligent design of life in the entire universe. And let me get into why
Please.
that statement. So this gets into Nikola Tesla. So Nikola Tesla, he has this famous quote. He says, basically, if you want to uncover the mysteries of the universe, it's found within the numbers 3, 6, and 9. He realized that there was a repeating pattern of life everywhere, all on Earth. If you see the designs of like a honeycomb or the designs of the flowers and patterns everywhere, it follows and mimics this design of 3, 6, and then 9. It's basically, it's a repeating pattern of life. It's a life pattern. And it's possible evidence to also discuss the idea of an intelligence that for our universe as well. It's like a pattern, it's like a blueprint. It's a blueprint of the creation of life in the universe. Now, the reason 3 is the first number is that 3 is the first most simplistic number where you can create a triangle.
Yes.
Right? And so we get into, the tetrahedron and all of that, right?
Can't close a shape without at least 3.
And so we're talking about this type of pattern-like design that mimics life, the creation of life everywhere in the universe. And that pattern that he had identified as being like a blueprint. Okay?
Do you know how he came across this and when he did?
Using, when he was doing cymatic types of projects. You know what cymatics is?
No.
Cymatics is when you use electricity, playing with the magnetism of the earth, and it creates like these designs. It's like plasma type of electricity designs, and it creates the cymatics. And I'm not an expert on this. I just want to point out there's people that could talk much more extensively about this than I could. But it basically is a way of seeing patterns that are designed based on electromagnetic forces and magnetism, and it creates patterns. Like there's already this natural inherent pattern that comes from energetics that then it's embodied through physical things. Right? Shells and shells and flowers and other things. It's a type of design that has to do with the creation of life and how life mimics this pattern. And he determined that through his experimentation with plasma and with electricity and magnetism. And that's where you get down that whole rabbit hole of free energy and understanding that there's an energetic force that has to do with the magnetism of the earth and all these things, right? Well, getting a little away from that, we find that pattern was known about by the ancients. They knew about this
3, 6,
pattern
9.
of creation. Yes.
How do we know that?
Because when we look at all of these symbols, you look at every single symbol that we're looking at except for one, the cross. Cross is more of a totality symbol. But you look at the step pyramid design, there's always 3 levels to it. Every time we go around the world, whether or not it's Peru, and I just got back looking at it, for instance, there's a place called the Spring of the Nicea at Ollantaytambo, has 3 levels to it. You can also go across just down the road from it to a place called Napa Iglesia. There's these doorways that are like false doorways. There's always 3 levels every time. Anytime you see these ancient motif designs, you see this type of pyramid-like 3-level pyramid design or a 3-level kind of entrance way. Like, for instance, if you look at the Gate of the Sun at Tiwanaku and Pumapunku, there's a doorway there. If you look at the backside of that, there are 3 levels to that. Just like Viracocha is that's depicted on that is standing on a platform with 3 levels. Okay? So you get this repeating pattern over and over and over again. They show 3 over and over everywhere. And then you see the pattern of the flower of life, which is 6. And then you get these 3-level step pyramids, like in the Kef bas relief. 3 pyramids, 9, right? 3 plus 3 plus 3.
Yep.
Every single time you look at the motifs and designs they had, they were mimicking this pattern of creation in the universe. Like they already understood it. And this gets down into this whole discussion of whether or not this lost time period of human history, these incredible cultures, the reason they were able to build the things that they were, these magnificent megalithic things that we have no idea how they moved them, how they carved them, any of these questions of how they did these things they did, it comes down into, well, did comes down to the question of, well, did they understand physics and aspects of the energetics and designs woven into our universe that Nikola Tesla stumbled upon? That's really what this conversation is about, is whether or not there was already something known that is not like he invented it. It's like he found it again.
Yes.
Through what was already,
Rediscovered
rediscovered it from what was already known. And they may help us to understand the capabilities of this lost civilization to do the things that they were doing, because they understood these fundamental key things of not only the earth, but the universe.
But if something's like that simple, that it's amazing, but it strikes me as something that they could have figured out just looking at physical patterns around them, as opposed to putting it to work, say, totally technologically. And when I say technologically, I'm referring more to like what we have now, like computers and things like that. Technically, everything is technology, like when you're building something or something like that. So let's keep it simple. But they may have been looking at those things on a simplistic level and possibly discovered something that is insanely accurate and points to underlying scientific discoveries yet to be made after them that could help us go down the right track in that way. Whereas when Tesla's looking at it, and I hope this is making sense to people out there, but when Tesla's looking at it, he's now at a point where we've advanced more in human history. He's working on things that are highly complex and would have been viewed as insane magic by those previous civilizations, and he's able to more advance that into more of a modern version of the theory while taking the base case that they figured out, meaning they weren't more advanced than where he is, but they did have certain things figured out that were ahead of their time, if you will.
Okay, I'll give you some examples for why I think it's more complex and they knew more than that. First of all, we have this premonition that's been very much established into our mindsets, that if it's old, it's primitive. That's often something that is, oh wow, that's really old, so that must be, or that's primitive, so that must be old, right?
I agree.
And I think that is the first place we need to try to separate, is to say, well, wait a minute. Yes, everything in the last few thousand years, like Stonehenge and other things, they're more primitive, older designs. I agree. But when we're looking at this time period of what the things that we're looking at right now, like Vaughn, around the Osirian, around parts of Peru and Bolivia, we may be looking at a completely different chapter of human civilization in which they knew things and understood things that even we don't know today. And let me get into why I say that. Let's get past for a moment that they built things that we don't know how they built them, and moved things that are so enormous that we don't know how they moved them. Like, for instance, in the Great Pyramid of Giza, the King's Chamber is over 150 feet above the base. And yet in the King's Chamber, there are blocks of granite that are 50 to sometimes 100 tons.
Yeah.
How did they move them in there? How did they put them in place in there?
I've never heard good explanations for this.
It doesn't make any sense. Now, except for the fact that we're dealing with a culture that wasn't using primitive means to do that. Because it doesn't make sense that they were using, pulleys and whatever systems it is to do that. It's so massive and so perfect in its designs. Just put that on the table for a minute. That's kind of sophistication. Now, then go to Lake Vaughn. You have that level of sophistication there with blocks that are unbelievably large and finely cut. But then you have these symbols we find around the world that have this type of connection back to understanding these fundamental principles of the universe. And we're going to get into that. These fundamental principles of the universe not only are just mimicking the natural environment of creation they see around them through the flower of life, it gets far deeper than that. As I've talked about in the Kef bas-relief, these massive stone boxes, they're like granite, they're basalt boxes that are feet across, they're enormous, they're multi-ton granite boxes. And I got a chance when we were at Kef Kalesi to go down into the storage unit to see them, and there's more than one. There's actually at least 10. And I got to see 7 of them in a storage room down there. And what they have on them are not just random symbols, but they're basically the fundamental principles of what we think of as what became Hermeticism and the knowledge of Hermeticism all around the world. The ancient Greek and Egyptian knowledge that became what are called natural laws, or the laws of the universe. And I'll get into what that means in a second. But they show things like this type of step pyramid-like design that has the same parameters we see around the world as this concept of understanding time and understanding the Trinity, the aspects of the totality of what makes us us. Now, if you take all the symbols they have there on the Kef bas relief and you put them together, what I believe they truly show to the tree of life, the step pyramid, the pine cone, the flowering that we see in the passing of all of it, what I believe they represent is, and I've studied and talked to many, many experts around the world, is over and over again it's echoed that they're trying to talk about this balance of creation, destruction, and harmony in the entire universe. So I'll give you an example of this. If you're Julian is an extraterrestrial from another planet, okay? This is the best way to say this.
Okay.
You're like, hey, I want to go check out Earth. Let's see this cool place, right? You come to Earth and no humans are here, and you land in some beautiful place, and you're a scientist and you're like studying everything. You're like, wow, look at this, how beautiful, how perfect the balance and harmony of this planet is. Right? A tree has leaves, the leaves fall, turn into soil. You then have the nutrients for something new to grow. And then it rains, and then sometimes you have droughts where something will then die. So then that nutrients can then lead to the regrowing of something else. You have just the right amount of sunshine, just the right amount of cold, right? Like I heard there was a wonderful, I was listening to a physics whole discussion the other day with Brian Cox.
Yes.
Who, did you see the thing he said? He goes, did you know that if the Earth and the moon were in just 10% different location than they are, right? Just 10%. If the Earth was 10%, further away than where it is, and the moon was 10% further away, especially the Earth from the sun, if 10% further away, the Earth would just be a complete ice cap. It wouldn't be any life here.
That makes sense. 10%'s a lot.
10%.
Yeah.
10%, and I might even be close to less than that. 10% the other way, it would be an inferno here. Everything would burn and there would be no life here. The means for which we have this harmony here of balance is incredible.
When you look at the probabilities of us existing and being able to function in the environments with which we have to choose from on this earth, it gets stressful to think about because you're like, whoa.
It's almost impossible that all of this would set up in the perfect way that it has.
Yep.
If you look at the balance of the Earth, the moon, the sun, for its distances to each other, and how the whole system plays into the harmony of things on this planet with tides and life, it's actually unbelievably strange how in the impossibility of it occurring. Even the formation of the moon and the location of the moon is, and the size of the moon versus with Earth, the whole thing is very strange. But the point I'm trying to make is that there's a harmony and a balance that exists here on Earth, and it's an extremely interesting, intelligent design based on that harmony and balance. These civilizations seem to understand the details of the importance of that harmony and balance, and we're encoding all of their symbols and motifs to show that. It's like they understood the blueprint for the fabric of our reality, and they understood the fundamental principles for why everything worked the way it was, why everything functioned the way it did. Not only did they understand it, but it seems that with the gods that are depicting and showing, holding balance over it, that there's something completely mysterious going on here, where there seems to be the whole nother level of intelligence, we'll call it.
What do you mean?
It doesn't look like it's just a civilization of people that are showing this balance.
The aliens.
There's something else going on here. I'm not going to say aliens because
You just did.
You said aliens. There's a celestial intelligence that seems to be playing a part with maintaining this balance here, is what these depictions are showing. They're showing passing the knowledge to the civilization. It's not the civilization people doing it. Every depiction in this is an image of Haldi, this creator god within their pantheon culture, who we see is nearly replicated with Viracocha in South America. And it's replicated with Kukulkan and Quetzalcoatl in the Americas, Mexico and Central America, and in Enki in Mesopotamia, and other places where there's this type of celestial intelligence that is passing this knowledge, but not only passing it, they're in charge of preserving and protecting it. That's what it seems to show on every single relief, every depiction.
What makes you say they're in charge of preserving?
Well, look at right now that's above there, okay? This is what we're looking at as Ionis. In the center of Ionis, you can see Haldi. He's a winged god. Whenever you see these
Wait,
depictions...
on this picture?
Yes. Can you see Haldi next to each cross?
Oh, yes.
Now, on the very left side,
Can you
on
zoom
each
in on
corner, you see griffins on each corner. You see that? Okay, those are the griffins, and then you see a very mysterious type of hourglass with like a sun symbol.
Yes, below where the...
Yeah. Now, you see Haldi on the bottom parts around the sun, and then you see Haldi kneel down in front of the left and the right crosses up there. Do you see that?
Yes.
Okay, in the center, he's not. Because, and let me go over what I think this means. I believe it has to do with doorways of time, like timekeepers. And because the symbols that are on this are all symbols of the sun. It's a sun temple. And they're talking, and sun is usually the way you track time. And the way you track time is through measurements of the sun. And the depictions on this and on the Kef bas relief, all of them, they're all identical. They're all about these pillars of balance with the tree of life and passing the knowledge of the tree of life to this civilization. But it's never people on it. It's always this god Haldi and his altar god to Sheba, the god of destruction. So it's like this two symbolic aspect of a creator and a destroyer. Because if you had a world where nothing died, you would disrupt balance, right? Death is an integral part of life here, right? The cycle of rebirth and then death is an important aspect of all mortal existence here, of all physical life. It has to die eventually and then be reborn again. That's the cycle of life. So on the Kef bas relief, it shows to Sheba on the left and then Haldi on the right passing the knowledge. With the pine cone, with the tree of life in the center, with the pillars on each corner, with the step pyramids and the flowering of life at the top. The whole thing discusses this aspect of preserving balance and harmony here, but not just now, for all of time. And what I believe these symbols represent with the cross that he's kneeling down and showing is the balance and harmony that exist in all, not just Earth, but in the universe, with these celestial creators, that they are maintaining balance for all of time. And that the three doorways that we see, the three doors, is not only representing the three aspects of us, because remember, we're the microcosm of the macrocosm of the universe, but it's talking about time. So look up there for a minute, and you see the left, the right, and the central cross. Past, present, and in the center. Past, present, and then the future. So
Can you scroll to the right, Alessi, on the picture? If we come out.
So
for a minute.
if you're preserving balance in the past and the future, you would be preserving balance in the present.
1, 2, 3. Okay.
And so again, there's a lot of other symbols on other motifs that are really unbelievably interesting. But when we look at this civilization, this lost civilization from before the last Younger Dryas, the mysterious thing is that how did they possibly invent everything that they invented? Right? When we look at the Sumerians, they invented agriculture, mathematics, animal husbandry, basically laws and rules, mathematics. Everything was invented that time period. But where did it come from? Where did any of this knowledge come from? How could you have a civilization just wakes up one day and understands the fundamental principles of the universe and understands universal laws?
Is there an explanation for, having their own, maybe something we haven't found yet, evidence of this, but having their own people who were the Nikola Teslas of their time that could have figured this out, meaning it didn't come from like a celestial place. It actually did come from someone, like the apple falling on Newton and being like, holy shit.
Well, yes, but it comes, the part of that, to answer your question, is it seems as though, and all the tablets describe this, when we look at the cuneiform tablets out of Mesopotamia, they describe these teachers around the world called the Apkallu. that traveled around the world to pass knowledge, and this could get into a great conversation, talk about the pine cone and handbag as well.
Yeah.
Is that we see evidence around the world in indigenous cultures and ancient cultures. They talk of, and they have these symbols everywhere. Is this passing of knowledge around the world and creating civilizations, but out of something. If you had, let's give this as a preface for a minute. If you had knowledge lowered somewhere, like if some place had the ultimate knowledge that was given to that place, that created some kind of a grand civilization, and then they were traveling around the world to create shoots of that civilization, and you had teachers traveling around the world doing that, that's exactly what we see with symbols everywhere on the world. Like, to give you an example, this mysterious pine cone and handbag we see that's all over Lake Vaughn and in Mesopotamia is shown also across the world in like the Olmec civilization in Mexico, right? And we see it at Göbekli Tepe on the pillars. We see it in other numerous cultures in different parts of Iraq and other places where there's this depiction of knowledge being passed around the world. Go to the Vatican. There's a giant statue outside the Vatican of a pine cone. Giant statue sitting right outside the Vatican of a pine cone. And we see the same cross from Ionis in all of the Vatican on the mitre hat and on the cloak they wear and on the staff. There's like this underbelly of ancient knowledge that seems to have passed around the ancient world, then destroyed, but then preserved and protected in small little key pockets by different secret societies and other groups to preserve it. And one of the challenges has been, well, what do these symbols mean, and what do this knowledge means around the world, and how do we understand and figure that out? And I had brought up to you talking about this new piece of evidence that's come forth for the handbag that may completely change our understanding of what the handbag means, and how we finally have some definitive evidence of what it means. And I can give you a background on that.
Please, yeah. This was before we were on camera. This is kind of blowing my mind because it's like a map within a map.
Exactly. So I'll give a little bit of background on this. Is in the 1800s, Austin Henry Layard was traveling down on a boat in the Tigris River in Iraq. And outside of the area of Nineveh in Sippar, that area of ancient Iraq, he saw a huge mound that looked artificial to him. And he subsequently came back with an archaeological team. They got permission from the Ottoman Empire, who was in control of that area at the time, and they excavated this area, and they found it to be an extension of the Ashurbanipal Palace. Now, if you remember, we talked about Ashurbanipal.
We did.
With the ancient library,
yes,
right, that connects all around the world, which, by the way, if nobody knows, you know the famous writer H.G. Wells?
Of course, yeah.
H.G. Wells, yeah, he called the Ashurbanipal Library the most important ancient library in the world. That's what his quote was for that library. So he was studying it.
You were saying that the Library of Alexandria even pales in comparison.
Yeah, because it was all paper records and it was younger. This is an ancient library of cuneiform records and murals and statues from all over the world. Ashurbanipal was an Assyrian king that was a son of Sennacherib, who basically he was a priest as well, and he went around the world and collected all of these ancient relics from around the ancient world, and he believed it was very, very important. So he amassed it all together. Now, we've talked about the Ashurbanipal Library, but we haven't talked about what was in his palace. So Austin Henry Layard finds this palace in the 1800s, separate from the library. They're part of an area, but in the palace contained these 12 giant murals that are like 7 feet tall, made out of gypsum alabaster, okay? And they have been frequently shown around the world when people are talking about the pine cone and handbag, because they have all of these different depictions of eagle-headed winged gods, and also just regular horned-headed winged gods as well. They either have an eagle head or they have like a human-like head with horns on top of it, okay? Well, 12 of those were found, 12 of them. And those 12 were brought to the British Museum in the 1800s. But the British Museum didn't have room for them to house them all, okay? And so they sold 12 and there may have been more than 12 originally found. Well, they sold 12 of them off to a private collector in None other than New York City.
Can we go find him?
We can go find him.
Who is he?
That private collection was put into a part of what became the New York Library, but was then moved years later, and it was displayed in the early 2000s in the Brooklyn Museum.
So it's there. It was displayed then, and it hasn't been displayed since.
Yes. And so somebody actually tipped me off to this. I will not take full credit for this, but I appreciate the person who did, is that we have been studying all of these depictions of the handbag around the world. Every single depiction of the handbag has nothing on it except for little like creative designs like little circles and things like that. It's always blank. And this big controversy and discussion has been, well, what are the handbags? Are they a physical object? What's in them, right? Or are they something symbolic? What does it mean? And there's been so much debate and discussion for countless years about this. Now, of those 12 murals that ended up in the Brooklyn Museum, they're all identical except for one. Only one of the murals that was brought there has something carved within it, in the handbag. Okay. And now I showed you offline this before just to give you an idea of it. But on this handbag is its own depiction carved in it of the two eagle-headed gods,
yes,
with a tree of life in the middle, with Anu in the center with wings, and then passing the pine cone to the tree of life. Okay.
Yep.
Now, this gets into what I believe the handbag truly means, and I think is evidence to finally prove what it means. Remember when I was talking about how these civilizations seem to have the knowledge of all of life, the creation of life, the balance and harmony of life. And so they have, you see the pine cone, which by the way, the pine cone is like a seed of the tree of life, but it's through a sacred geometry. So sacred geometry gets into what I was just talking about with 369 with the flower of life.
This is what Leonardo da Vinci discovered.
Well, with Tesla too.
Yeah, but the sacred geometry was Leonardo da Vinci, right?
Leonardo da Vinci drew the three doorways on the Last Supper. I actually just went to the display in Los Angeles, had the Da Vinci display right now. I just got back from that actually a couple days ago.
Wow, that had to be insane.
Where you can look at all of his designs and everything.
They didn't have that one that's in Saudi though.
No, but they show the Last Supper, and they show how behind Jesus is the middle door. It's just like the Kef bas relief with the three doorways with the central door in the center that Haldi has passing the knowledge to the central door. It's the same thing. Now, this pine cone aspect that we see, they're passing the pine cone all around the world, right? And they have the handbag. Now, again, this is the whole debate about what the handbag means. Well, this evidence gives us strong a hypothesis to present that it is, in fact, a symbolic depiction of having the totality of all knowledge, being like the guardians of all knowledge, but not just like regular knowledge, the knowledge of all of creation and balance in the whole entire universe. And this is where I believe it gets into the mysterious concept that these are not just cultures around the world that discovered it, that it was something that was passed to them, and that's why they're depicting this all around the world, because it's like something divine, right? If you were to think of it as divine knowledge being then passed, and so they would show it in all of their artwork, because they then had their civilizations created through like divine means, which then often became corrupted and destroyed later on. But it started in this divine place. And I think this really helps us to understand these symbols in a way that it never has before. And we can finally understand, look, that not only are these some of the most important symbols in the world that tie into a mysterious civilization that would rewrite history as we know it. I don't think it would even just rewrite history. It's not just about saying our time period is older than it is.
Civilization meaning a civilization that maybe isn't even necessarily from here.
Something that may have been lowered from a celestial higher intelligence from above. Something great. That we were the progenitors of something far greater than just hunter-gatherers. That's why humanity seems so different and is talked about in so many ways of us being from a divine place. And I think this is really where we can merge with some of the religious concepts, with esoteric mysticism and ancient concepts, is that all this evidence is pointing towards us coming from or being given divine knowledge that was then created and then passed around the world to create the greatest civilizations and the greatest structures that have ever existed.
Do you think that, this is going to get a little meta right here, but do you think that there's any evidence to point to that divine knowledge being, how do I want to say this, related to like a simulation or something like that? Meaning these ancient people maybe couldn't understand what a computer is or what the concept of that was, but the divine beings that were giving them this information or whatever were actually a part of the people controlling. I'm just thinking this way because I just had Riz Verk in here as well, who was going through this whole thing, who's laid out his own simulation theory. But they're like controlling the video game that is us, and these people therefore were looking at it like, oh, I can't understand this, but thank you.
Yeah, I do think there's an aspect of the simulation theory in our universe that may be accurate. I can tell you why.
Please.
If you ever get into ancient Hermeticism, again, this is where we can tie into the Emerald Tablet. We can finally tell the real story of the Emerald Tablet, not the Emerald Tablets. They are very different.
Okay.
And this is a great segue. We can get into that. But
yeah, bookmark that for a second.
Hermeticism is based on the ancient Greek and Egyptian knowledge of Hermes. Okay, Hermes Trismegistus is basically the equivalent of Thoth in Egypt. They're ancient. They're basically sages of humanity, right? That were teaching great knowledge to humanity. Now, there's a number of different texts associated with Hermeticism. The Hermetica, the Kabbalion, if you've ever heard of some of those, and some like Poimander and the Dragon, and all of these are all stories within what's called Hermeticism from Hermes. Now, Hermes describes how there is what's called natural law, and this gets into everything I was just saying. Mm-hmm. And all the symbols that are shown on these structures, all of it, is that there's a knowledge that became known again. So if you imagine you have an ancient civilization that perfects all of this because it's handed down to them, I believe. They lose it because they're destroyed in catastrophes around the world. And then another secret society and a group of civilizations emerges, and then they reclaim it again. Now, how they reclaim that is a whole nother conversation. Whether or not it was handed to them again or whatever happened, and then other civilizations emerge. Dynastic Egyptians, ancient Greeks, and they then incorporate that knowledge back into their culture. The flower of life, the symbols of the triptych, all of it reintegrated back in again because they understand it, right? Well, Hermes was basically the greatest sage of the Greek civilization. He is their patron sage who taught them all the knowledge, right? It's a mysterious place, like who was Hermes? Then you're now getting into a difficult road to answer, is who actually was Hermes? Was he just a man? Or was he something else, like some kind of a celestial incarnation of something greater, right? And so that's where that conversation comes in. But Hermeticism are some of the best records that have been preserved from ancient times of anything. There's more of the Hermetic stuff preserved than a lot of the other stuff because it got burned in the Library of Alexandria. It was destroyed, corrupted, rewritten. But the Hermetic stuff was particularly protected because people like Isaac Newton were really interested in it. And we can get into how that all worked. Isaac Newton ended up, I believe, a lot of what his influences were with developing the concepts of the scientific revolution that occurred in the 16 and 1700s came from him studying ancient Hermeticism and understanding, so Isaac Newton he was the one who developed all of the laws of motion, gravity, the Earth's understanding the planetary motions and how the precession of the equinoxes, and a lot of what we think of as called classical mechanics came from Isaac Newton.
He's the godfather of it, for sure.
He was only superseded when Einstein came along with the theory of relativity. Well, Isaac Newton, turns out one of his core studying areas was Hermeticism. In fact, he translated a version of the Emerald Tablet, which is an ancient Hermetic text. Okay?
Which is different from the Emerald Tablets.
Completely different. They could not be more different.
All right, so the Emerald Tablet and the Emerald Tablets, two completely different things.
Yeah, this has been an area that has been, I think, really misunderstood from a lot of different angles. I feel like the Emerald Tablets have had a lot of attention throughout the years, and I've even spoken about them earlier in my work, in some of the earlier books that I've done and things that I've written about. But the Emerald Tablet it needs more attention. It needs more people talking about it because it directly ties with a little bit more of a historical artifact that is more traceable, that has a lot more evidence to support it. So let me first mention what the other is, and then we'll get into the story of the Emerald Tablet. The Emerald Tablets is a mysterious writing from a man named Maurice Dorey. It supposedly is from ancient Egypt, but we don't actually have any evidence that it's true. No physical copy has ever been found. It was simply one man writing a bunch of things down that he says came from something. Now, I'm not saying it's completely a forgery and that there's nothing good in it. There's definitely concepts and things in there that are helpful and seem to tie to other things, but it's not like the Emerald Tablet where we have extremely tangible evidence from throughout cultures, throughout history, who retranslated it and had it be a basis for knowledge. So I think that one of the problem is that they get confused, and then one gets confused as being the other, and then vice versa. So I would personally lean a lot more on the Emerald Tablet for people that want a historical basis of understanding ancient Hermeticism and ancient Egyptian knowledge rather than the other. So, that's a whole nother conversation regarding if the other is real or not. Whereas the Emerald Tablet has a long history to it.
And how do we know this?
So the Emerald Tablet has been translated from not only Latin and Greek, but also Arabic. It's been in numerous cultures for hundreds and hundreds of years, and a lot of philosophers and experts have leaned on it because of the knowledge it contains. And as we were talking about before, Isaac Newton actually translated his own version. One of the versions in Latin that came out was from Isaac Newton, and he extensively studied the Emerald Tablet. And I believe, based on what you learned from the Emerald Tablet, that he may have formulated a lot of his scientific theories based on the knowledge that came out of that, which then leads us to be like, realize, well, is our understanding of science coming out of the 16 and 1700s, is it attributed towards from ancient Hermetic knowledge?
Do you have like examples of things he took from that
specifically? Okay, so one of the things he got are cosmic laws. So the laws that he discusses, the laws of motion, the laws of planetary bodies, the laws of life creating, I think different things that for the functionality of physical reality, a lot of that is discussed in the Emerald Tablet. So the Emerald Tablet it's discussing natural law and how everything functions in our world. So if we get into the background of it, if the famous concept as above, so below, I'm sure you've heard that concept, that came from the Emerald Tablet. That's where that concept first originated is talking about how celestial aspects like astrology and planetary movements play a huge role with how consciousness and life functions here on Earth.
Hey guys, if you haven't already subscribed, please hit that subscribe button. It's a huge, huge help. Thank you.
And that's where the idea that like Da Vinci got, where we are the microcosm of the macrocosm, is that a lot of what's playing out on the external is playing out within us. And a lot of those ideas came from that, but also natural law, like planetary movements and functions and how he determined gravity. A lot of those core concepts came from Hermetic knowledge, which is, again, it ties into your original question. How do we know that those ancient cultures knew more than just looking and mimicking nature? That they actually knew real detailed knowledge of higher level things. And so the story of the Emerald Tablet is pretty incredible, actually, and I don't really hear many people talk about it. So I wanted to tell you the story of how it got found. there was a man named Balinus. Balinus is described in the Arabic and Latin versions as being a philosopher and a mystic and a master of talismans who is studying ancient knowledge, and he's an esoteric master, and he ends up having a dream. This dream tells him of a statue of Hermes Trismegistus in which there's something buried underneath it. And so he goes on this expedition to go and find this statue.
Based off a dream.
Based off a dream. That's exactly
Wow.
what that really says. And so Balinus travels to southern Turkey to a place called Tyana. And in Tyana, he's searching, because that's where I guess his leads or his information has led to. He finds this ancient statue of Hermes, just like in his dream. And in below that statue, he finds an ancient crypt, a passageway that leads to a cave underneath. This is wild, but I'm telling you, it's 100% true. And when he goes down into this cave, he finds this stone statue of a man with his hands sticking out. And with two hands. One hand has the emerald tablet, and the other hand has a book. The book is called the Book of Secrets, or Secrets of Secrets.
The Chamber of Secrets.
It's wild, but this is the story that is actually has a lot of evidence to support it, that it's really true. Now, the emerald tablet was not made out of emerald. That's a misnomer. It was actually made out of jade. And that's the material it was called. It was just called the emerald tablet. But from that tablet, it then became translated in, again, I said Arabic, Latin, and Greek, and was taught by philosophers around the world. It became the basis for where the Philosopher's Stone came from. That's the entire basis behind the Philosopher's Stone. Is based on because the tablet not only talks about natural law and phenomenon, but it talks about alchemy. And it talks about how you can create any kind of alchemical output metal that you want out of two things, sulfur and iron, which is strange, but it discusses how that's the basis behind anything you want to create, including gold. And so that was where a lot of philosophers became extremely interested in the emerald tablet because of this idea of a philosopher's stone.
And where again did we get the story? What was his name?
Balinus.
Balinus. Where again did we get that story where it's
That
verified?
story comes from a number of Arabic, Latin, and Greek sources from different books, the Book of Creation and the Book of Secrets.
Mm-hmm.
There's different books that are based on the story of where the emerald tablet was found, and it's well documented from how that story goes. Because it was such an obsession of philosophers and alchemists, the story was continued and versed over in numerous different places, and actually has a lot of evidence to support it. That's why Isaac Newton ended up studying it.
And what years again is it purported to have happened?
The emerald tablet was found in the 8th century, around 1200 years ago. Balinus traveled to a place that no longer exists any longer called Tyana. And that was where this statue of Hermes was supposedly found, with this crypt where it was discovered underneath it. So again, we know that the Greeks had a lot of roles in southern and western Turkey. There's a lot of ancient Greek cities. And so we know that area was an ancient region, and of course ties into even some of the other things we were talking about. But it forms the basis of us trying to understand how ancient civilizations and cultures seem to understand knowledge different than even we do today. And then other cultures have come along and tried to mimic it. But I don't think we personally give ancient civilizations enough credit, because we often are looking at them through the lens of a primitive type of people.
Yeah, you make a good point on that, because I'm guilty of it too, where you just think about the concept of how long ago it was and what we've been fed about, how humans have evolved over time, which includes our developments and our technology. You assume that they weren't brilliant. A major exception always occurs whenever we talk about things like the pyramids and stuff, because we're like, oh my God, how the fuck did they pull that off? But there's still the thought of like, oh, those people they'd fucking look at an iPhone like no different than a fish would look at an iPhone. Like, what is that? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean that the knowledge that they possessed or were able to put into action was not something amazing, including things that we don't understand. today.
Absolutely. I mean, we have to think about technology in different ways. I think that that's one of the core things here to talk about is that our technology is based on these machines that we've mastered to become advanced, right? Like if you think about how far we've come from the very first computers and radios and televisions to where we are now with phones.
Crazy.
It's unbelievable, right?
Yeah.
But what about the idea of how far a culture could come thousands of years under their belt with a different kind of technology? What about the technology of harnessing forces of the sun through plasma and different aspects of energy? One of the examples I want to give is if we look at Ionis, and the structure of how Ionis is built, it's very mysterious. I'll give you an example. I was in the Coricancha in Peru. We did trips to all those locations. And when I was in the Coricancha, it's an ancient sun temple of the Inca or pre-Inca civilization. And in fact, you can walk down roads that are right adjacent to the Coricancha, and you can see really primitive Incan work on one side, and then the highly advanced work on the other. And that's just like the Urartians, like I was talking about, where we're giving credit all to one culture for building something rather than accepting that they may have adopted and built near or on top of other older things. Well, in the Coricancha, there's this altar, this very, very mysterious stone altar that has these edges that stick out, these square-like elongated edges I showed you before.
Yep.
And when I saw that, I couldn't believe it because that same design is the same design as the pillars we see at Ionis and Kefkalesi outside of the temples. There are these pillar designs that have these extensions sticking out of them that are perfectly aligned in a square around these structures. It is very mysterious because we know they were sun temples, and we know that they likely had some kind of a function with the movement of the sun. But how they worked gets really mysterious. A lot of people that I've talked to that deal with sacred geometry and looking at sacred architecture, there's actually two people on the team, Lydia de Leon and Arturo, that are part of these groups they're called Geophilia, where they study sacred geometry and structures around the world for energetic components and how it alters different states of consciousness and different energy fields. And what we've found is that a lot of these designs, both in the Greeks and in earlier cultures, are designing buildings to have a harmonic type of solar component that connects geometry and sacred geometry with energy in a way that we don't understand today. It's very, very mysterious, but that same pillar around the world, the same design, is where we find it all the way over in Lake Vaughan. But not only that, there's a T-pillar that's also exactly mimicked around the world as well. This the idea of this T type of design that Robert Schoch and I were just analyzing at Chavus Tepe with Hans, these huge basalt T's on the ground that we see in numerous other places like in Tiwanaku in Bolivia. It's like they're mimicking all these same designs, but I don't think it was just for the reason of, oh, wow, that's cool, let's make it too. I think that they were designing and creating temples with some kind of a functionality that we don't fully grasp or understand today. If you look at our building style, we build just to get some primary function of livability and make sure the structure stands for however long it can. But we don't build based on sun movements and energy. We don't do that. We just don't do that anymore. It's like we don't understand any longer what they used to know. And I say that because when we look at the designs specifically of places like Ionis and others, this type of pillar design, and the type of way that they were mimicking the solar movements, it can't just be a coincidence. It's not just for tracking time. There's something else going on. And the reason I say that is that the stone that they picked at all of these sites is like a basalt andesite, is the highest level of magnetite type of stone that exists. Meaning it's a magnetic stone. So if you went up and you put a compass on it, your compass would spin. I saw the same thing in Peru, all over the place, in Bolivia. They're all highly magnetic stones, just like at Lake Vaughan. They're only picking these magnetic type of stones. But what's bizarre is that they're building on top of limestone hills. And even though they could just quarry the limestone, they weren't even interested. They were going, as I said, sometimes hundreds of miles to go find these highly magnetic type of stones to build with. That's not a coincidence.
I would say no.
It's like give me an example in Egypt. We see the granite, the pink granite and the granite stones in the King's Chamber and throughout the Giza Plateau. They didn't take any stone from around the Giza Plateau to build that. They went all the way down the Aswan Quarry, over 400 miles away, to obtain that granite, right? That's the same thing we see in Turkey, and same thing we see in South America. Why would a civilization do that if it was just like, oh, we could use any stone we want to? It brings up questions about whether or not there was something very specific that they were looking to achieve by building with those types of stones, something energetic. And the reason I mention all of this is because it gets into Hermeticism and it gets into the flower of life. It gets into all of this knowledge is that they were trying to do something with building these structures in a certain way that unlocks something, Julian. It unlocks something with this idea of, right, like we know that they built on the 30th parallel most times. The Giza Plateau, Eridu, Persepolis in Iran, numerous other sites are on the 30th parallel of Earth. Yes. That's what's known as the geodesy. It's a concept where you take these geomagnetic locations, these geolocations that are important in the Earth, and you build in specific spots because it has some kind of relationship with the Earth and then the cosmos. And that's why you then find things like the Great Pyramids of Giza is aligned to the 3 belt stars of Orion. We see so many of these correlations with building to align with stars in the heavens to mimic down below.
Now, obviously, that means they understood something up above at the time and perhaps understood more than we give them credit for about that. But is there anything to say that these ideas are like not just symbolic that they were doing that rather than something deeper, maybe scientific with where they place these things?
Well, that's what I mean is not just, I think the symbology comes into like artifacts and motifs showing us teachings. But what they were doing was something tangible and physical, well, energetic. They were actually trying to do something that is far more than just based on a theoretical concept. They were creating some kind of a form of energy. This gets into Nikola Tesla. They were creating some kind of a form of energy. I'm sure you've heard of like the Giza power plant and all these different ideas. Well, they have a lot of things in common. For instance, the Great Pyramids are built over aquifer centers of water, right? We know that water is an excellent transmuter of electricity. And we see that the Great Pyramids had limestone covering the outside of it, but in the inner parts had granite inside the center. Like, why do that? Unless there's something to do with the energetic components of all those stones. We see the same thing in all these parts of the world, is that there's specific stones used and then relationships with water and relationships with the locations of the earth and then relationships with the heavens. They're all being taken into account right now. It's like they understood these concepts far more than we ever have, or at least have in modern times. And I think that that's why when we look at the past, we should look at it in a completely different lens. I see it as humanity can go down 2 different paths. And I think there's only 2 paths that make logical sense. There's like an industrial type of path that's based on consuming large amounts of resources and then creating like machines and things to do work and a lot of things like that. And that's the path that we've taken. But there's also a very different kind of path. And I think Nikola Tesla really talked a lot about that alternate path, which is why I think a lot of his work was silenced and a lot of it was demonized, is that there's a path of building in a more organic, harmonious way with the earth and the cosmos and having a connection and relationship with magnetism and with the types of components of the earth, like within stone. Nikola Tesla believed that a quartz crystal was a type of living being. He talked about that in his work. Not a living being like we think of an organic living being, but some kind of a non-organic vibrational being.
What does that mean?
It means that it has some kind of existence that's beyond just regular stones. That quartz itself is almost alive. And we find that quartz...
But it's not breathing.
Well, like a resonator. No, it's some kind of a resonator of energy. And I'm not an expert on this area, this field, but I can tell you it's interesting to me that the Earth has more silica quartz than any planet we know of.
Does that change our definition, or would that change our definition of life, though?
Yes, I think it would.
Because to me, I mean, without looking it up in the fucking dictionary, to me, life is something that's living, breathing, and has the ability to feel.
Well, he talks about how the vibrational frequency and how quartz reacts to different things gives it more characteristics of something that's more living. And again, I'm not a physicist, but Nikola Tesla believed that quartz had certain properties. And again, you know what the primary mineral in granite is?
No.
Quartz. The primary component within granite is quartz. And so isn't that interesting that the Egyptians would go to such great lengths to obtain granitics that are high in quartz? And we find that in other stones as well. Could it
be for the, just to, sorry to cut you off, but could it also be anything with aesthetics though too? Like aesthetically speaking, meaning there's like a simpler explanation, like they wanted granite as opposed to something else.
So they go more than 400 miles and they try to move multi-ton blocks.
I agree. That's pretty insane. But like we see people are willing to do some crazy things for aesthetics. You know, there's people who will fly halfway around the world to get, you know, the piece of jewelry they want or something like that. That's kind of a bad example, but you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like there's where there is a demand for a small supply of something or a rarity, if you will, something shiny. Human beings throughout history seem to gravitate towards that. So is it possible that that could be an explanation?
Well, I guess the way that I'll answer that is we have to understand the undertaking, the absolutely insane amount of work it would have taken to construct and build these things.
Oh, yeah.
So if it was based on aesthetic principles, it would be almost like an insanity. And it doesn't seem that these ancient cultures, the ancient ones, before even the dynastic Egyptians, I mean, we're talking lost civilizations, were doing anything by accident. It was like everything was on purpose. There was no mistakes made. We don't find these beautiful murals with like mistakes on them. I just showed you the Ionis altar. We were looking at it. They didn't make any mistakes on anything. Everything that we're looking at from this time period, it was like everything was done almost perfectly.
Yeah.
It was very mysterious, where it was like everything was well thought out and was done for a very important reason. And what those reasons were, we're still exploring today.
Yeah, it always just gets strange to me. I was saying this earlier, but whenever you see things that are halfway around the world from each other, from these ancient times, that have not just similarities, but they're quite literally like the same thing. Like some of the pictures you were showing me off air with some of the stuff you were just describing maybe 15 minutes ago with the four-sided edges of some of the stuff they were building. It's like you see that and you go, how the fuck could these people in Turkey have passed this so perfectly to these people in Peru or Bolivia? You know what I mean? Like that's the stuff that keeps me up at night, because it's like, what is the connection there? It's not as simple to me as, I mean, I guess technically it could be, but it would be insane. It's not as simple, though, as like a few guys arriving on some primitive boat from all the way across the Atlantic and saying, here's how to build a pyramid, or here's how to build, you know, the edge of granite or something like that. And here's a book with a how-to on all of it. That seems like a stretch to me.
I think it is. And you can't ignore it when you look at the same type of gods that they're showing. I'll call it gods. These figures that they're showing that are passing this knowledge. They're identical. Again, I mentioned Haldi is nearly identical in all his traits as Viracocha. How is that a coincidence? How is it possible that we have, again, the same designs that were like symbols of teachings that we see not only across continents, but even woven into things like Da Vinci's work and others? It's very mysterious. It's like we've forgotten what we once knew. And we're trying to put the puzzle pieces back together to something that is the puzzle of who we are and the puzzle of the divinity of what we used to know. And I think that's the fun in this, is that, you know, we become so disconnected into it. And as we put these pieces back together, we realize that it's far more than just ancient history. it's our own divinity of the universe, and realizing that we are far greater than what we've just simply been told, that we are like creator gods that have forgotten we are. And our abilities, I think the abilities that we once had and the understanding we once had is just like an echo of its former self, lost over time from great millennia of forgetting the status of where we once stood as balancers and stewards of this earth, and remembering how important we are. And here we are now destroying the world and polluting it and fighting out with silly wars, not realizing that we're all just human beings here that are divinely connected everywhere.
Not to say that any of that is acceptable to me, but at the same time, something like wars, though, that's been happening forever. Every civilization we look at was at war. Except
that we have no evidence that the lost civilizations ever were at war. And that's the weirdest
really,
thing.
But it would be during a time where the Earth is unbelievably less populated, so harder to go find people. And do you think that could really be the case? Like ancient civilizations just went against all human nature and didn't have war? That seems like a stretch to me.
Let me give you an example, though. Would you say the inherent nature of a person is violence, though?
The inherent nature? No.
Okay, so if you were being, we talked about how like someone can raise, remember, different dogs, right?
Yes.
And you could raise one dog with like very kindness and positivity and giving it a reinforcement of love, and that dog will probably never bite anyone its entire life, right?
That's right.
Now, and if someone at the same token raises a dog through violence, that dog will probably bite you.
That's also right.
Well, what if humanity is the same way?
It could be, but when you ask me the question of like the inherent nature of people, whether or not I think it's violent, on an individual level, I don't. On a group level, I do, because it's not their main inherent nature. It's one of them, though. There's a lot of inherent natures to human beings, but absolutely one of them is violence, because what we see across studying any type of expression or behavior or whatever is that as you increase the size of the population, like a group, right? You move from 1 or 2 people to 4 people to 10 people to 15 people. Eventually, the groupthink ideology can fall into line to where all you have to do is, let's say, the first 14 people of a civilization aren't born with inherent violence, or their environment doesn't mold them into be inherently violent, and they're all peaceful and whatever. But then the 15th person who joins the civilization, maybe their upbringing was a little different, maybe they were born with a screw loose or whatever, and they're violent. Maybe at that point that doesn't start them wanting to go out and hunt other people for war, but that voice gets into the room. And then, somewhere along the next 5 people to join the civilization, another voice of violence gets into the room. And eventually, this, the strong man will of certain people who want to go out and seek violence and seek war and conquer and things like that becomes what the group gets behind. You see what I'm saying?
No, I totally understand what you're saying. But what if, instead of using that analogy of like a person training a dog, what if we were talking about civilizations who were not training people, but teaching people different values than they were taught later? And now, let me give you an example of that.
Please.
And all of the symbols from like Vaughn and around ancient Turkey and the pre-Egyptian stuff, where we have symbols, Egypt's a bad example because there's only we have the flower of life, but I'll take like Vaughn, for instance. We don't see one war symbol anywhere in all of these motifs we're looking at, whether it's a Kef bas-relief, sites like Ionis, the underwater stuff, all of these sites, there's like 15 different sites that I'm looking at in that area. There's never been in Andesite a spear or a bow or anything, a sword, ever shown in any of those symbols, except for the Urartian artwork. Later, we see all kinds of war symbols all over the place. We see them practicing, they were fighting the Assyrians. And then we go down into the Syrian civilization from, 3,000, 3,500 years ago, and we see all kinds of murals of them fighting in that war all over the place. But they also have this carrying down of some of the knowledge from the past woven in, like we're in a different time period. Like there was a lot of conflict. But to say that because we've had conflict for, let's say, the last 4,000, 5,000 years, right? Doesn't mean that humanity always has, because we're looking at it through the lens of that time period representing all of humanity. And when I'm looking at a lot of these symbols, we never see a war symbol. Not only that,
But how much evidence do we even have? We're trying to find civilizations that are lost. They're lost for a reason because we don't have much evidence of them.
but if they were practicing war, don't you think that some of those symbols would have somehow found their way into these locations?
Yeah, and who's to say that some of them actually are and we haven't interpreted them correctly yet for understandable reasons?
That's fair enough. And that was actually one of the problems of archaeologists in Lake Fawn, is that they were trying to interpret through the lens of the Urartians as a war culture, and they were misidentifying a lot of these symbols. We talked about it the first time, how the symbol, the pine cone, was identified as a spear by archaeologists when they were originally excavating in the 1960s, these locations.
That's right.
And they were labeling others as like windows in a castle and different things because they were looking at it through the lens of a war culture. So if it depends on the lens that you're looking at. If they were able to create such magnificent structures that were based on energy and harmony, and those core principles were woven into their civilization, isn't it fair to say that maybe they were different than we are?
I can't rule anything out, to be fair to you, right? Because I wasn't there. But, and again, I'm looking at it through the lens of humanity that I know. So to kind of go against my argument at the beginning of this, I'm looking at it through that 4,000 or 5,000 years or whatever, as you just pointed out, as opposed to something that could have existed before. But like, immediately I'll think of something like an Adolf Hitler, who was objectively a horrible person on this earth, who did horrible things to millions and millions of people around the world. And in the middle of building his Nazi Germany, objectively, you can also say that some of the buildings and architecture or things that he built looked incredible, but we don't look. You see what I'm saying? Like, that doesn't take away all the other shit he did. So some of these ancient civilizations, and perhaps I'm thinking about this wrong, they could have built things that were beautiful and harmonious or whatever and been doing blood sacrifice on the other side of it, for all I know. I can't rule that out either.
Well, it's interesting that these periods of instability seem to coincide with time periods of humanity not having, or in not having at least as the foundation of their society, that ancient knowledge we were talking about. Maybe, I think that's where religion has a lot of crossovers. Religious teachings, like morality teachings, have a lot of crossovers with these symbols and these teachings that we're talking about from these ancient cultures, because they seem to all be leaving behind like a message. Yeah. And they're all saying like, look, this is how you reach higher states of consciousness. This is how you reach harmonious balance with everything around you. This is how you become like gods. This is how you walk with God in heaven. All these things were being passed down. And when those were the moral basis of different groups, they didn't commit those violent acts. But when those things were lost, then they did. So I think one of the things we have to consider is whether or not humanity was shepherded by some bad leaders that didn't want that to happen. We have to entertain the idea that there were powerful secret societies and groups that didn't want us walking down that road.
Who do you think are the most notorious of those?
Well, I mean, let's give you an example. I think Constantine was a really bad guy. Constantine he took the Roman Empire, turned it into the Byzantine Holy Roman Empire, and that's where we have the basis for the Old Testament. It's called the Council of Nicea. Yeah. This is where the Council of Nicea occurred, where certain things were kept and certain things were kept out, and things were decided, and that's when the Council of Nicea in that time period of history is when ancient history was determined. Did you know that?
So Council of Nicea comes up a lot on this podcast.
Yeah.
And I've had different people from different angles, everything from you to Wes Huff, talking about this in different ways. I did not buy all of Wes's argument on the Council of Nicea. I'll say that. Does that mean, though, that everything was like written down about Christianity then, like the Da Vinci Code would try to say? Not necessarily. But Do I think that the history, and I would say this about any ancient text or anything we're studying, do I think the history is perfectly reported in the Christian religion? No. I don't think it's perfectly reported in Islam. I don't think it's perfectly reported in Judaism. I don't think it's perfectly reported in stuff you could find from the Library of Ashurbanipal. Like, nothing is going to be perfect, but where can we land on the idea of like, ooh, this is in the right direction? I think that's why we have these arguments. But yes, if you want to explain more about the Council of Nicea, I'm all ears, because it's a very fascinating thing, considering that prior to this, I think it started in like 313 AD, and maybe ran to like, there were things still going on in 325 or whatever. But prior to this, Christianity had effectively been illegal within the Roman Empire. And now you had an emperor saying, like, not only are we going to legalize it, it's a growing portion of people, so we want to get out in front of this and adopt it for our own.
Yeah, and I'm not an expert on that area. I don't want to claim to be. But what I do study is how that time period, a lot of things were established, we'll say.
Like what?
Like history. The narrative of history, Herodotus started that, but it became woven into an accepted teaching through the Roman time period of, well, how old is human civilization? When did it begin?
Yeah.
That whole time period was established. And once it became established, it hasn't budged since then. We have the same history that we've essentially been teaching for like 2,000 years.
Yeah, which I think is problematic, because we see, I mean, you've presented some evidence yourself today just on things you're looking at, but we see so much evidence of these things when we start talking about the Younger Dryas and things that could have existed before that, where there is, even within secular culture, where people maybe have nothing to do with religion or haven't really thought of it through that lens, there is a worldview that has been just built in for hundreds and hundreds of years that has them kind of biased towards not necessarily even creationism, but their timelines wrong.
Yeah, because it's been established. It's a lens. You know, we were just talking about the lens of how you look at something, right? Our lens that we've been taught is that our civilization is 6,000 years old. It emerged in ancient Mesopotamia, and that nothing that existed before that was anything other than hunter-gatherers and then Neolithic humans. That's it. That's what we're told. Anything older than that. And yet we get places like Göbekli Tepe that are accurately dated with radiocarbon dating that are double that age. It doesn't make sense. Give me an example. We just had, within the last couple of years, all the announcements out of White Sands, New Mexico. Do you know about that? Where we've been told, and it's like, hey, this is an established narrative that humans got to the Americas through the Bering Strait, right? They got no earlier than 13,000 years ago. And that was how they got there, because it was frozen and they walked over and got here, except that we have established now with scientific evidence that White Sands footprints of humans are like 26,000 years old.
And how were we able to establish that?
They were able to uncover a layer that had been covered over. Remember we were talking about how if things are buried, they have a better chance of being able to date them?
Yes.
And so they were able to find different artifacts and different organic things within those buried areas near the footprints that have given them dating. And I'm not an expert on that, so I don't want to talk about that too much, other than I know that has been well established and fought by mainstream academics that does not want to accept that age, because that age is double the age that we're taught, that any kind of indigenous or hominid type of group was in the Americas. But it's the same thing that's echoed around the world, is that, you know, we need to start looking at science as that the basis of science was intended upon, which is always being an objective observer of whatever evidence it is, and going along with that evidence, not having a predetermined conclusion that you stand by and you don't move from.
And this is the frustration. You know, and we've talked about this in different levels on some of the podcasts we've done in the past, but, you know, seeing this play out more and more and more over the last couple of years, especially, it's like given me more viewpoints into just how polarized this is and where there's wrong on both sides. You know, as an example, we saw a debate, I guess like a year ago or whatever, with Graham Hancock and Flint Dibble.
Yeah.
Now, to be clear, Flint is very much like a traditionalist, comes at it from the traditional lens. He's a smart guy, but I think there's things he's certainly closed-minded on. And like his personality is like a little bit Weasley for me, so it wasn't exactly like a sympathetic figure in that way. I'm someone who has enjoyed a lot of Graham Hancock's work in the past and think he has done some good work. That said, that was a really sad debate for me because it felt like Graham really got his ass kicked. And it wasn't so much that Flint kicked his ass. It was that Graham spent the entire time just, instead of really presenting evidence, ranting and raving against everything in quote-unquote mainstream archaeology to the point that like he wasn't even open to something being right in there, which to me, the tragedy in this is that we're starting to incentivize creating the same sin from the other side, in this case, like the alternative side, that we were calling out on the mainstream side, which I agree with calling out. Like when you tell me that mainstream archaeologists and mainstream academia have been presented with some legitimate evidence, and I got to review it myself and whatever, for whatever that's worth, but they've been presented with some legitimate evidence that something in America could be twice the age that we once knew. I would want to know all about that. I would want to try to dig into that more. I would want to try to write papers on this. Fuck it. Peer review it. Do whatever you want. But they've created an ivory tower culture where they're like, that's just a bridge we don't want to go down. So we'll accept what we have because we think that could be right. We don't even want to explore whether or not the other thing could be right. That to me, I don't know how to, I mean, that'd be like the fucking $10 trillion question. I don't know how to solve that, but it seems to get worse with time. And it comes back to what we were talking about with the whole war culture thing, what I was saying, which is groupthink. Like it's very hard to take a group of people who are, maybe there's a small percentage of them who are pushing this line, but they hold some power and the other people just kind of fall into line. And I think that's what's happened maybe on both sides of the spectrum at this point.
Yeah, I think that it's a really sad thing to see science, mainstream science and archaeology be so closed-minded to evidence that's being presented, whereas you were also pointing out that on the other side, sometimes our side can almost seem like frantic to try to prove our point, but not accepting that both sides are probably kind of right in their own, in some aspects, right?
Yes.
So it's not like we throw the baby out with the bathwater.
That's right.
We have to understand that there are aspects of traditional archaeology, and I get this all the time. Doesn't mean that everything's all wrong, right? Just because like NASA lied about some things doesn't mean all things in space are wrong.
Yes.
It's not an end all be all to that type of thinking. It's like, look, a lot of ancient history stuff is very valuable that we've uncovered and presented. I think the Akkadian, the Assyrian cultures are, for instance, and Babylonians are very well mapped out. But there's then the mysterious Sumerians that have evidence of being from like a different time period that, well, we should look at that more. Yeah. It's not like saying all of the Assyrian and Akkadian stuff's wrong, or all the Roman stuff's wrong, or all the Greek stuff is wrong. That's not really I think what we need to do is work together as objective researchers and scientists to bring back something that we once had, which is the wonder of the unknown and wanting to know more and being open-minded. Why is it so dangerous to have an open mind to ask questions?
It's so stupid, We were talking about my friend Luke Caverns, who I think you know, off camera earlier. And one of the reasons I really love Luke and his work is because he comes at it from both worlds. He was trained traditionally in academia under Dr. Ed Barnhart, no less, fucking well-respected genius of that space. And he plays in the space where he talks with guys like you and talks with guys like Graham Hancock and is very interested in having that open mind and trying to figure shit out. He's also somebody who is willing to say the words, I don't know, or I was wrong about things. And I think that's part of the problem here. I think that's really what the nail on the head is. Instead of celebrating things like that, now, if someone's saying, I don't know, or I was wrong every 5 minutes about every single thing they find, I mean, they probably don't know much. But like, when we villainize even possibly saying those terms or not falling into line, we are creating these barriers, and they're only going to get wider and wider and wider. And so it's really important that like guys can sit across from each other and find some space to say, all right, we can agree to disagree on this, maybe come back to that, but we can agree on this point. And I it's not like I haven't seen that before. I have seen that. But the things that get a lot more attention now are when you have the two sides screaming at each other, which I've been a part of too, like as a podcaster here. You've seen that before, but it's like, it's not really constructive.
No, it's not. I think it comes down to compartmentalizing things. I think that's actually where the real problem is. Imagine Julian Dorey is an archaeologist, and he's studied archaeology all his life, but he scoffs at the idea of energetics and sacred geometry and spirituality and metaphysical anything, right? Scoffs at it. He doesn't even want to hear it.
Mm-hmm.
Now he's in a site like Ionis that has all these, and Kefkalesi with these teachings that are about metaphysical teachings that are woven into Hermeticism and have all these symbolic aspects and aspects that deal with metaphysical reality. Would Julian Dorey know how to understand that site at all?
No.
Because he's coming from it from the wrong lens, right?
Yep.
And so I think that's the problem with archaeology, is that archaeologists are not open to considering something that is still considered kind of woo-woo a little bit in the mainstream. And that is this entire world that exists in the metaphysical aspect. Understanding how, like Nikola Tesla type of concepts, ancient, like energy, how energy can be created through structures and magnetism and solar alignments and how all these things function. If we don't have any clue of how to look at that, if we don't study the philosophies of theology and the philosophies of Hermeticism, and we're trying to understand an ancient culture that's embodying those concepts into it, how would we ever understand what we're looking at?
I don't think you would. And you know, again, not to be cynical, I really hate that. Sometimes you got to play that role to be a little cynical. And I get that, but I don't like doing it. I like to be an optimist. But you do look at history in other lenses that maybe are similar, and the endings aren't good. You know, you look at something like the Templars, which developed into having a different view on things than the Catholic Church. And that ended with the church working with fucking France to have these guys rounded up on Friday the 13th, and boom, you know, Jacques de Molay and all the way down, like, they're killed and their ideas die with them. Does that mean the Templars were right about everything? No. But like, maybe they figured out a few things.
They had the Ionis cross.
Sure. But like,
right?
There you go. But like, maybe they figured out a few things along the way that are different than the traditional teachings that didn't have to turn it on its head.
Yeah.
You know, I think about stuff like this a lot because you made a great point a few minutes ago. It's like, it doesn't have to be everything or nothing. Things are a mixed bag. It's like the old Bruce Lee quote. It's like, take what is good, discard what is bad to make, you know, your own whole with different people. And that's what I love about this job, because I sit across from people all the time who do all different things, that have all different kinds of opinions ranging across various topics that we cover in here. And it's like, I know they're not right about everything, but I want to figure out where they make good arguments or whatever, and hear them out and let the audience decide for themselves. Because guess what? I say shit that's wrong too. Like, believe it or not, I know that sounds crazy, but like, you know, that's part of the learning process.
Well, maybe instead of competing, maybe we could start collaborating with ideas. I think that's right. There's that movie, A Beautiful Mind. That's the whole concept there. I love that. Is that, can you imagine if humanity and archaeologists and everyone that's a scientist or scientific kind of mind would all like come together and try to work on something common, a common goal? Can you imagine where humanity would be?
The greatest lie I think that's ever been sold to us is that religion and science are opposed.
And I think that's really what we're seeing here, is that it gets into what I just said. Spirituality and religion, the only difference between them really is that one of them is based on a theology of a specific type of group presenting ideas that are like this is this. But spirituality, the ideas of metaphysicals and spirituality, they have a lot of crossover with a lot of religions.
Hey guys, if you haven't already subscribed, please hit that subscribe button. It's a huge, huge help. Thank you.
It's not that far off. And yet, that religion, like you just said, and spirituality are like off limits from anything related to like science and archaeology.
Which is seeking the answer to the same question. Science is trying to figure out where it all comes from and what it all means. Religion is trying to figure out where it all comes from and what it all means.
Maybe
and somewhere we said, you know what? We got to say fuck each other.
maybe we need to start combining ideas together and looking at that in unison and realize that maybe everybody's a little bit right on both sides.
Absolutely. Couldn't say it better myself, man.
And that's one of the reasons why I think what we're doing is so fundamentally important with the documentary is having for biblical experts. We have biblical experts, we have megalithic experts, we have sacred geometry experts, we have architect experts, we have polymath experts, we have archaeologists, we have 2 archaeologists, we have geologists.
That's great.
So we're coming at this from, you know what, if we want to understand how to rewrite a narrative and open up questions that we haven't yet been able to about lost civilizations and just ancient history, maybe we need to look at it from all sides.
If you got down there and you did an extensive investigation and you ended up, the evidence started to mount to point to it's not what you think, would you be willing to admit that?
Of course. If you look at where I was 5 years ago, my thinking, it's dramatically changed.
I see a different, I'm just pulling this observation right now, but I've sat with you in this studio 2 different times before where, we recorded for like 6 hours. Last time, as you said, was over a year ago. You're a little different today.
Well, thank you.
I like it.
Because we have to evolve. Yeah, like our thinking might be a certain way at some point in our past, but that's how the process of raising your consciousness and taking in new ideas and becoming more enlightened in whatever topics you're talking about, that's what needs to happen, is that you're like, you know what? I used to believe this and the evidence is mounted enough so that I don't believe it any longer. Why are we so afraid to admit that?
Yeah.
I used to be, I'm not afraid to admit it. I used to be a big Ancient Aliens guy. Like back in the day, that was, you're looking at the lens, oh my God, everything's Ancient Aliens. Doesn't matter what it is. You like cover your ears.
What's that meme?
Right? Yeah. It's always Ancient Aliens. And then now it's like all these years later, I'm looking at a lot of this with like, well, I don't think I really looked at it in the right way before.
Good for
I
you.
didn't really have enough evidence to really study this in the way where I was understanding it in the right way. I was looking at it through the wrong lens. And I'm not saying that I'm not trying to close the door on that entire topic. That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm saying I've certainly evolved from a way of thinking that is much more evidence driven, where it's like, if you're going to make a statement, if you have nothing to back it up at all, why are you even making it?
Yeah.
Okay, that's your opinion. That's great. But to me, we need to bring science back, and not just the place of academia, but how about like anybody who wants to be an objective researcher?
Sure.
Why can't anybody who studies enough be an expert on something? Do you need like a piece of paper that tells you are? Especially if you are going to a place that is teaching like a script-like way of thinking that you have to adhere to and like memorize answers. What is that?
I think you're hitting the nail on the head with part of the problem, though. And let me look at it from that perspective, right? Because I didn't end up being a doctor, for example, and spending fucking 8 years of medical school and whatever it is, and all these years of residency and really putting the time in. It's like, if you are, let's stay with that example, if you are a doctor and you did put in all this time, and whether or not you and I agree with whatever the curriculum and how they teach is or not, that aside, like, it's very hard. A lot of people have to put themselves through incredible debt just to get through all that. Yeah. They spend all these years. They learn things of which there are some things that are objectively, as we know it now, true. There's other things that maybe should be updated. But, then someone comes along who, maybe didn't even go to college, or let's say they even did go to college, but they're not a doctor. They didn't go to medical school. They have limited training in this kind of stuff. And they scream at the whole medical community and say, you're all wrong about this thing. Even if they're right. I understand where the bias of, wait a fucking second, who are you to be telling us, where that comes in, and then what happens? The wall goes
credibility,
up.
Right?
Yes. And, I've thought about how to try to bridge that gap for so long, but it's just something about human nature where the time and effort spent, the toil, the blood, sweat, and tears, if you will, affects our ability to be objective on things. And I understand that, but unfortunately, it does create situations where you can't get to a truth because you're preventing that conversation from even happening. And I think it's no different in some of the spaces you're talking about too, because like archaeology, you go to school for years and shit. And there's certainly a piece of that where I can see people like a Flint Dibble or something, being like, come on, I've been studying this all my life. What, did you read a fucking book one time? There's a reason. He has some logic there, but it doesn't mean that things that are being introduced aren't from someone who's smart, who has done like their own research, so to speak, and has uncovered some things that maybe we should talk about more.
And I think it creates a corundum there. It creates this problem where you have a set of teachings that are laid out for you to go to get an education in. And in order to get that education in that, you have to adhere to whatever that is saying. Okay, you can't be an archaeologist and write your dissertation papers on lost civilizations. You're going to fail out of archaeology. You're going to be laughed out.
That's a good point.
So what that creates is a hole, because it forces whoever wants to have an academic background that has credibility automatically has to be closed-minded, because if they're not, they will not be able to be accepted into some kind of a viewpoint of credibility. So you're creating a hole there. You're creating a problem, whereas that paradigm is starting to shift. You're starting to see that shift right now. Like, for instance, we have 2 archaeologists on this.
Yeah.
One of them is named Omer Tanyurek, and he is one of the archaeologists at Kef Kalesi, one of the sites that we work on. And he is just coming at this of saying, you know what? I'm an objective scientist. I want to look at what the evidence is.
Good for him.
That's it.
That's great.
He's not coming saying, I believe this, or this is what it is. He's just simply saying, I think that the evidence should be looked at again. Maybe we missed something. Maybe we need to look at this through another lens again. Maybe there's more to this than we've shown. And I think that comes up over and over again in the old paradigm. And I'll give you an example, is that a lot of archaeological papers that I've read on a lot of these sites, they are often unwilling to acknowledge, other than pointing towards interesting coincidences and possibilities, but rather than acknowledging something is a certain way, they will fall back on a previous peer that's highly valued to them, who wrote their like books that they studied, or some kind of an archaeologist that they value and look up to. If that person had a viewpoint that is in contradiction, they are unwilling to often go against that.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Why is that the case? Why should a scientist not be objectively exploring all possibilities just because another scientist said something?
Yeah, we've been bringing up Tesla all day in different contexts, and I think about it a lot because, first of all, he was forgotten for a long time, and it's only in recent years that some of his work has actually been given some of the respect it deserves, the work we know about, right? But the thing I always wonder is how many more Teslas there are out there that we'll never find out about. And it's because of exactly what you're talking about, that groupthink, closed ivory tower where it's like, wait, no. In order to pass this test, you have to say this. That's how you get through the door. And when you look at this in political situations throughout world history, if you were looking at it in that lens, that never ends well.
No.
Now this isn't politics, but like the same human nature concept applies. And for this space of discovery and history, that probably won't end well.
No, it doesn't end well, because then we become stagnated with a certain ideology that holds us back often. And unfortunately, that comes from a place of some kind of a theology or some kind of a viewpoint that has been determined for some reason, right? Something has been determined for some reason. Like, well, the ancient history timeline has been determined for a specific reason. Why? Why is it only 6,000 years old? What was the reasoning for why they did that? Is that based on an ancient religious reason? Is it based on just a concept of wanting to keep it there? We already, like, if we just give the White Sands example and Göbekli Tepe and all these other dating examples, it's strange to me that we would have an ideology that would have parameters that don't permit anything outside of it. And I think the reason is because if we were to understand a different chapter of us that existed, it would open up a lot of questions about, what did they know? Why did they build it that way? Wait, those aren't tombs? Oh, so the pyramids never had pharaohs built in them. Why were we told that they were tombs? That's misdirection. And why were we told they were built by that civilization? Okay, well, what do they really do? What's the functionality of the pyramids? So they weren't tombs. So what were they? You see what I mean? It opens up enormous amounts of questions. And I often get people, they're like, who cares? Why don't they just open it up to whatever? Because I think it's dangerous. I think that the paradigm of opening up all of these things that we talk about is a danger to a lot of things. It's a danger it's a danger to some aspects of religion.
Sure.
It's a danger to some aspects of the industrialization of our species and how we think. I think it's a danger to the structures we build. Why do we build them that way? Wait a minute. So these kinds of structures that we build now are like disconnect us and keep us in a different kind of state energetically. Why, there's a whole host of different reasons why looking at the ancient past and understanding this time period and what they built would be dangerous to our thinking now. I think that if you give me an example, if I told Julian Dorey, I'm like, hey, Julian, by the way, reincarnation is real and that you're an eternal being of energy that never dies. And the lessons you're learning right now are just playing up into another lifetime that you come back again. And by the way, you're really like a god here who could literally become whatever he wants and could follow down the path of enlightenment. Like that, Julian Dorey might be like, shit, what am I doing with my life?
It's an existential event to hear something like that. Yeah.
Whereas rather if I go, hey, Julian Dorey, you live only one life. You never exist ever again. You come from a small town where you're never going to amount to anything. Not really you, but you're never going to amount to anything. You're going to work in like a factory. You're just going to have a couple kids and die, and you're not going to leave anything behind. You really don't matter at all, by the way. Mm-hmm. What a different paradigm to look at your life. And I think that's what is a real danger, is that the paradigm of our reality could significantly change if we understood our past and who we used to be.
And that's the thing. Anytime you have something that can run up against someone's family, health, money, or meaning of life, those four things in particularly, all bets are off, especially when you do that at scale. And what I mean by that is, to use your religion example, for instance, let's look at the three most major world religions, like Islam, or the ones we talk about the most: Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, right? And then let's throw in Hinduism, let's throw in Buddhism, some other huge ones as well. If all at once you came out and said, even just like, hey, not all of it's right, here's where you're right, here's where you're wrong, with proof to all the people across each of those religions individually, that there are enough people within those populations who have literally tethered their life and their meaning of it here to what they believe, which is the time spent on studying that, the time spent on living that, the time spent on trying to wrestle with that on a day-to-day basis. That becomes an existential type crisis. I don't even need to see simulations to be able to be like, yeah, that's probably a problem. So when I think about some of these things where there could be some answers in ancient history that get a little dangerous, I can see where some of these people subconsciously, the people maybe who have control over that, subconsciously even, not even consciously, are like, oh, we don't want to go down that road.
Exactly. And I think what you just said really hit the nail on the head. I think that's why sites like Ionis and other sites around Lake Vaughan are such a danger to the outside world, because they could rewrite a lot of our thinking. And not only that, but so many of the symbols and the teachings relate to core concepts we see in ancient civilizations, but even philosophy and other things. There's so much carryover that I think that it could significantly rock the boat with such established narratives and teachings that are such an integral part of us now, and that mindset would be extremely dangerous. Yes. And I think that has played out in some very nefarious ways in the ancient history of these places. And I could give you some examples.
Please.
When I was digging into these, I discovered some very concerning aspects that has occurred here, which is why I think most of the world doesn't know about these sites yet. There was a paper written by Cambridge University that I have that was written like 30, 40 years ago. And it was discussing a specific type site called Topricoli. It's right along Lake Vaughan. It's one of the sites I talk about.
Topor, is that right?
Yeah, Topricoli. I can give you it later. But
Okay.
Topricoli was the first place that got my attention with a site that was deliberately dismantled. Dismantled.
How do we know that?
Well, that was the whole premise behind the university paper from Cambridge, was discussing that a number of the megalithic blocks that were on the basis of these temples had been removed and moved to undisclosed locations and disappeared. Like basically
By the researchers.
Yes. And so the more that I started digging into it, the more that I found that it had all occurred in this certain time period of history. During the 1960s, the late 50s and 1960s, these sites were all discovered around the same time. There was a number of them: Asver Natepe, Kef Kalesi, Topricoli, and then some potential other ones as well, Kyla Deer, and some other ones that had images taken of them, black and white images when they were first found. And as I dug into and went into further, I found that many of them, none those bases and those temple stones and that made up the original sites were no longer present. Mm-hmm. And I asked some archaeologists on some of my trips, and they gave the answer. I asked why they would remove stones from the sites, and they said it was to protect them. And
that's never a good answer.
And so it really brought up some serious questions, and I'm writing about it in the new book. I'm in the middle of writing it now, and we're investigating, exploring it. And I'm not trying to say archaeologists that are there today. I want to make this very, very clear. I am not saying that archaeologists that are working on these sites today had anything to do with that time period. I want to make that super clear. Whatever happened in the late 50s and 60s seemed as though there was, again, like I said, 3 or 4 of these sites I've determined were deliberately dismantled and removed, and then their contents disappeared from history and was never seen again. And some of those groups that were involved were places like the British Museum and some other archaeological institutions who are highly prized and valued today. And it begs the question of whether or not there was a complication that was determined that was contradicting a previous mindset of thinking. This is where I'm getting into the road of what we were just saying, is if you come into a place with a predetermined history of thinking, this is all your Artians, let's go excavate these sites, and you find a number of pieces of evidence that point towards a completely different time period that is not your Artian, that's mysterious, that has symbols of like ancient symbols from pre-Knights Templar, all these things like chalice, all these symbols. Would there be interest from different places to not allow the world to know about that?
How did you find this paper?
I dug it up through working with my colleagues, and I can send you the paper.
Please.
After we're done this, that actually talks about it, and I've highlighted the areas that it does, where it was proven in the paper that after a certain time period, and I can paraphrase, and essentially it says after by 1970, very little, if none of the original foundation stones existed any longer.
Alessi, can we make a note to put a link to this in the description when Matt sends this so that people can check this out?
I can pull it up.
Yeah. But we'll pull it up.
I'll pull it up after. I don't have the exact.
We'll put
the exact
the link
name off my head.
One of the things I'm thinking about, though, Matt, and this is pure speculation. This is based on zero evidence. I'm just listening to what you say right now. It's curious the years where this is happening, the 50s, 60s, right into the 70s, because it's after World War II.
Yeah.
And what I wonder is if there was a paranoia, I mean, this exists at high levels, that new discoveries of ancient history could give rise to a bastardization of that said history
Yeah.
that could be utilized by someone to come along like a Hitler, because we know Hitler was like obsessed with ancient history and some other things as well, and then bastardized that into these crazy race laws and all this stuff he had. And I wonder if the world, you know, the order of the world, so to speak, coming out on the other side of that was, paranoid about maybe something like that occurring. It doesn't make it right what they did, to be clear, but I'm wondering if that had something to do with
I think it might have, and I'll give you an example. One of the foundation symbols of the Nazis was the swastika.
Yes.
The swastika came from ancient civilizations. If you go to the site called Baalbek in Lebanon, an ancient megalithic site, giant blocks, the second largest blocks in the world, up to 1,200 tons each.
Mm-hmm.
They're massive. I'm sure you've heard of Baalbek.
Oh yeah.
The swastika is present there carved into stones, and we know that Hitler had gone to those locations. And so what was scary was that they were using important ancient symbols that had to do with spiritual, metaphysical concepts, and then bringing them into like a very demonic, nefarious kind of way.
They bastardized it.
Yeah, they definitely bastardized it. And could that have been a concern of others? That may have been one of the aspects of this, is the worry of that, and the worry of how the ideology might change religious concepts, archaeological concepts. It basically, if you have a situation where you don't have an interconnected world yet, you know, 50s and 60s are like, there was no checks and balances.
There were some, but compared to today,
compared to now, you could do a lot more things.
Yeah.
It's very concerning to think that there were deliberate things that might have been hidden because they didn't go along with the narrative. And I'll give you an example. There was a site called Azarinatepe that is right in that area, and there were these massive steles found. Huge. Steles, these long, tall column pillars that are single stones, multi-tons, beautifully carved, very precise. They are in the Von Museum now, but the Von Museum took 20 years for them to obtain them. You know where they were before? In a military base.
Where?
There's a military base right below Azarinatepe. They built this military bunkers and these huge military place right around this ancient site, which is really strange. And guess where they also built a barracks? Right around Toperkali as well. They built
are these American bases
no,
over there?
These are Turkish military sites that they had built around ancient history areas. And they had artifacts in some of these bases that became known, and then museums wanted to obtain them to preserve them, and it was extremely difficult to do that. But why? If you're a military place, why would you have artifacts stored there?
Yeah, the storage of the artifacts that part's interesting.
Storage for something like many years, like over 20 years.
Yeah, that part's a little weird.
I'll give you another example. When they were at Kefkalesi and they unearthed these huge bas-reliefs, the first one that was the best preserved ended up in a museum, the garden outside for 20 years before it ended up inside a museum, outside, just sitting outside. It was like these places and these things, they were hiding them, and they didn't want these things being found. The Cambridge University article pointing and showing evidence that they were dismantled and removed from the sites is completely unorthodox from archaeology standpoint. You can only remove artifacts to preserve them in a museum setting to study them. You don't remove entire temples. You don't remove entire structures. And then more importantly, to have them disappear and we still don't know where some of them are is very bizarre. There's another site called Basalic that's right next to it that has the same type of pillars that were found that were brought to the museum, but the first ones ended up in a military base. And I want to point another place out. And again, the world doesn't even know about these yet. I've stumbled upon something that's very significant. There's a site called Kaya Ladir that was flooded under a reservoir in the 1970s and 80s. It's now on the bottom of a reservoir. You can't even study that site anymore.
Hmm.
Very interesting that these certain things have happened in that region. Why do I think that happened? I think that the ancient religious context connecting back to the Noah mythos, to the Ararat region, and this region created a very serious situation for religious groups and other archaeological groups of having these mysterious megalithic ruins with symbols and types of architecture that didn't match anything from that time period, creating what would have been potentially, and I mean like a firestorm in archaeology at the time. That was when archaeology was really being written in a lot of mainstream books and established into what it is now today. And so now we're just starting to explore these sites in a different and methodical manner, but it's to find that these places were dismantled and to see them like that, it really actually hurts my heart to think that places like that could have been completely either destroyed or removed so that we don't get to know about them and it's hidden from us. It's a very sad thing. And again, I want to say that no current archaeologists that are working on those sites had anything to do with what was previously done to them. And and as I've been told, it was a different time period. That's the answer that I've been given.
And it's like, this is the age-old situation where people in the know think they know what's best for everyone else because of what they know that they can't talk about. And so they do what they think is the right thing. And in doing the right thing, when that's figured out what they did, if this is making sense to people still, if you're following me, it now becomes the wrong thing.
Yeah. And I've had a lot of people tell me, Matt, why do you even bring that up? Like, why don't you just focus on like what the symbols say and talking about, how it could be part of a different civilization? Why bring this stuff up? Because I feel like it's not right to have something that happened bad in the past go unanswered for. I think people need to answer for things that happened that were bad. I don't think that it's okay to let something slip under the rug because it happened a long, long time ago. And so we just don't care about it any longer. Is that okay? Is that morally okay that something destructive that destroyed somewhere very, very sacred and important should just be not discussed because it's a sensitive area? I would rather be on the right side of history to bring the truth about something to light rather than deciding to know something really important and to not talk about it because it's sensitive. I think it's important to be in integrity at all times and to voice the truth and not be afraid of the consequences, because I think the truth is what we really need now.
It's a fair point. It's a very fair point. Unfortunately, human nature is when you can't see the bodies stacked, which in this case, it's not that type of situation. Time heals the wound for enough people that, it doesn't have the pressure to go back and look at it. It's not to say that shouldn't be the case, and it's not to say that something really wrong didn't happen. Sounds like maybe it did. The thing that bothers me about what you're saying is when you talk about the storage of the stuff. That's where I go, oh, okay, there's some shit there. Because if they were just building bases or whatever, they're building fucking bases in Turkey. There's ancient history everywhere. You know what I mean? Like, who knows all the ancient history we haven't uncovered there just because of the nature of the geography. But when you talk about the fact that they're actually taking some of this stuff, dismantling it, and putting it in storage in these places, when you talk about the fact that there are papers in Cambridge University that write about these actions happening and admit to it, I got to look at it. But
I'll send it to you as soon as we're done. Yeah, I'll give it to you.
That's egregious for sure. And I would at least love to know the logic behind what it was there.
And I'll give it one more example is in Kefkalesi. There's a great team in there working there now. So I thank you guys. I love all the work you're doing, and I've had a chance to work with them, and I'm going to be doing more in the future. I was shown a storage room that had 7 of those bas reliefs that I sent. There's a picture you guys can put up after, but I had been shown, and they were all extremely destroyed. Like to the point where it was sad to look at the one that had been preserved in the Ankara Museum, the Museum of Anatolia history, and to look at the ones that were in the storage unit. And I found out that the reason that it happened was that they had removed them with bulldozers and had broke them all. And had broke them all during the 1960s.
Whoa.
During the same time period that these places were being dismantled, there was extremely poor archaeology being done where they severely damaged many of these to the point where they're barely even, some of them are barely even able to be recognized for what they were. And I look at that time period, and it's very sad to me that such nefarious and terrible things were done to these sites. And so I'm trying to put the pieces together for what I consider to be the new kid on the block for archaeology that's going to shake everything up and change everything, is that region of Eastern Turkey with these sites that are connected directly to Peru and Bolivia and Egypt and all around the world, and may change our understanding of who we are from a time period when something very special happened in that area. Something very special happened to Ionis.
I hope you're able to uncover that. And what I like is that you're going into it, first of all, with a really diversified team, which is great. And secondly, you're also going into it on an evidence-based mission here, right? Like, let's review, for example, the one down in Lake Vaughn. Let's review whatever materials from that kilometer-wide civilization we're able to recover. Let's figure out exactly if we can date it because of where it was stored underwater and what it may mean, and, figure out what that was. And that's how the process is supposed to happen. So kudos to you for doing it the right way with that, and I wish you all the luck. But, some of the things we've talked about in the past in ancient history, it's based on stories that are passed down for sure. And it's like, well, could that have been changed? Of course, human nature says that. And then, in the middle of this whole topic that's like kind of the 500-pound elephant in the room, the dirty word, so to speak, it gets to the things that are extraterrestrial over time. We get to aliens and whether or not they were here. And obviously, you don't want to fall into the I want to believe camp or anything like that. But it's certainly, looking up at the galaxy, it's like the probability of even what we know about the galaxy, which is probably minimal, the probability that we're the only intelligent life out there is so low. And then you wonder what the probability would be without knowing what the capabilities are of them, that they would have been here or have been around us or among us or whatever. And the big problem we run into, and obviously I've done podcasts on this, and it's a fascinating topic to me, but I always try to check myself with the realities here. The big problem we've run into is that we don't seem to have physical evidence of that stuff. We don't seem to have the, say, smoking gun proof. But when you're reviewing some of the ancient civilization things and you look at the artwork they did or the messages they left behind, gut feel, are there, or based on evidence, are there things you can point to that you think would support the fact that there is intelligent life out there and that life in some way or form has been here before?
Yeah, I'll answer that question in two ways.
Okay.
The first way, the galaxy in the universe is vast. There are so many star systems and places that could harbor life. I think life is probably infinitely all over. Yeah. But when we get into intelligent life, because that's really what the question is.
Yep.
Obviously, I think we could go to some distant star system and find a planet with types of creatures, animals, and different creatures and plants and fauna, flora and fauna there. Of course, that's gonna be somewhere out there. But that is aliens. In the end of the day, that is aliens.
Yes.
Okay, so fine. So that exists. But what about intelligent life? Well, I want to answer that with a perception, I think. The nearest star system to us is astronomically far away, to the point where it's kind of like a joke. And I say that because I think it might have been designed that way, to not have the pollution of just any culture that can get somewhere easily. They would have their own interests, right? You'd have, you see a movie like Avatar, right? You see something like that play out, where some corporation is like, oh my God, planet Tyranium in whatever star system has got a ton of gold, right? Or it's got a ton of whatever. Let's go there and just go get a bunch of it, right? There's a lot of other interests that are way beyond just that too. Like, whoa, well, let's create a colony there. Let's, whatever it is, it doesn't matter. There's so many reasons why if a civilization could get somewhere very easily, it might. And it would be potentially disastrous. And so I find it, I'll say comical, because I find it funny, is that when you actually start looking at astrophysics and you look at how close the nearest stars are and how far long it would take us just to get to them, it's mind-boggling.
Yeah.
It's like insane. You're like, wait. So even if we could travel the speed of light, it would take like 10 light years to get to the nearest one or something. And I'm just throwing that out there. I don't remember exactly what it is. But I'm saying is, like, first of all, we can't even travel near the speed of light right now. Not even close to it. And even if we could, it would take whatever long that is. It's comical to me because it seems as though it was supposed to be made very, very hard for any interaction in any way to ever occur. And I thought about that a lot. And I'm like, well, why, right? Well, maybe because of exactly what you said. What kind of interest would we have if we could get somewhere right now? If we could right now feasibly get somewhere without cryogenic sleep or something, what would we do to that place? What do you think we would do if we could get to a place that had life right now? Let's say there weren't even any intelligent forms of life there. What would we do to it? Right? We probably wouldn't do anything very good to it, would we?
Yeah, I mean, I would imagine we try to, well, even without it being intelligent life, but if it's livable, we try to colonize the place right away, use its
Colonization,
resources,
right?
etc. Yes.
Well, that could be very destructive to that place, couldn't it?
Yeah.
So as I've looked at this, I've been like, well, there likely is intelligent life all over the universe. And we're not the only ones. I don't know what it is. I don't know what it is looking like compared to us. But I can tell you that it seems inherently designed into it that we don't interact because of those very reasons. Now, what about some super civilization that reaches far greater heights than we have, but not just technologically? What if they somehow master things beyond technology, like somehow, like types of wormhole technology and ways to just get somewhere? What kind of consciousness would that civilization have at that point? Would they be fighting each other with war still? Probably not. Because if they had reached that kind of level, they probably would have banished war, right? Can we even reach those kinds of expedited type of states of consciousness? And
It's hard to guess because we haven't been there.
right. So if a civilization did get to a point where they would probably have reached some kind of a harmony within their world. How else would they have been able to achieve something that great unless they had stopped doing war and they were focusing all of their great minds on uncovering all the mysteries of the universe, right?
Perhaps they would have had to solve death.
And they would figure out things like Nikola Tesla technology, because how can you have energy that's not like free energy that can be utilized in ways that are, we can't have like combustible engines and things that are based on like just fusion. We'd have to have something extremely advanced, right? So I think to me that civilization would inherently reach some state of consciousness that they would be so highly advanced that they would understand the inherent nature of wherever they went and how it could impact that place, right?
Yeah.
So if that's true, and they could reach somewhere finally through eons of development and becoming a certain kind of conscious being, then they would likely know that they couldn't just pollute our world, right?
Yeah.
And so that's, to me, the most likely scenario for any extraterrestrial life is that maybe they're here and they're just watching because they know that they can't interact in any way because it'll disrupt the timeline that we're on. And it'll pollute something or influence us in some way. But then there's like a whole nother concept to it. And that's the whole idea of what Haldi is, what Viracocha is, what Enki is, what Kukulkan is, what Quetzalcoatl is, what all of these ancient gods and these like enlightened beings that are clearly not just humans. There's something completely different going on there. What is that? Why? What is that? Is that an extraterrestrial? Well, the answer for me, and this is the greatest shift in my paradigm that I've had since I started. It was really easy just to throw out like ancient alien. Oh, there's a super advanced species that got here and they're playing around with tech and that's why they seem so advanced. When you read ancient Hermeticism, you find some very important answers to this. They discuss it. And I firmly believe that Hermeticism is, without a doubt, and I'd probably put Gnosticism, some Nagamati, Gnostic stuff in there, and some ancient Sumerian stuff just below it, and some Hinduism, I put those in there just below. But I consider Hermeticism the greatest source of truth of anything that exists today. Because every time I've looked at who's valued it throughout history, how it's come from ancient civilizations, when I look at the concepts woven into these sites, they're all like laws in Hermeticism. Like, oh, so they already figured that out. I look at Nikola Tesla taking the same information. I look at the totality of all of it, and then I study it myself, and I look at all the concepts and laws, and it's like, that makes the most sense of anything by far that exists, that has come together with understanding natural law, understanding alchemy, understanding energy, the soul, the path of the soul, understanding spirituality, understanding the potential of a human and our divine nature. It's like Hermeticism is the totality of so much that's come together that's like, we got it down. Yeah. And so I highly recommend anyone who hasn't studied the Hermetica or any types of the Kabbalion and others to look at that and be like, I just highly recommend them. I'm curious if even Wes Huff has looked at those because I feel like, what does it really matter if other forms of teachings exist? Do we just ignore others because we only care about one? Because I look at everything. I think it's all valuable. I think that's how you got to be. I think there's in that camp. There's value in the New Testament. I think there's value in every aspect of teachings that exist. The Quran, all of them have valuable teachings within them. I just feel that the Hermeticism contains the most valuable from every side that I've looked at. No like person's agenda side, from a pure ancient place. Okay. Now, having said that, just building that up, it discusses our universe. It discusses what we are. It discusses, my favorite is Poimander and the dragon. Dragon being like the source, like God or creation as a dragon. And it's like having a conversation with Hermes. And he's asking him all these questions. And it's giving this perspective about everything that you go, if you're well studied, your intuition is like, that makes the most sense. And so what it says is that, I'll tell you the story here, the premise, and it might help explain to a lot of people. It says that there's a creator, a source, God, that is the source, and it's not male or female. It says that it's both. That is, it's like it exists, and that it created what we think of as the archetype of the universe, and that archetype took an extremely long amount of time to put together, to think about and put together perfectly. Once that was put together, the archetype was presented, but it wasn't a physical archetype. It was completely based on an energetic metaphysical archetype. And that when that happened, this creator created extensions of itself. Okay, we can think of them as like angels almost, and demons. And that those creators, their responsibility was to adhere to the laws of the universe that existed. Blueprints, one of them being that duality is a constant, which is why they're supposed to play the roles of angels and demons. Because duality is a constant that exists in all of the universe, good and evil. You cannot have good without evil, you cannot have evil without good. Simple as that. So that is a constant that exists. The other ones are the laws that were put into this archetype, this mold, it was called, would be then manifested and created by these extensions. That their job, Their primary job was to maintain creation and balance in the universe. It's wild, but that's what it discusses. And that they're like celestial creators. And it called them the second mind of God. The second mind. And that their roles and responsibilities were to create a physical manifestation of our reality out of a metaphysical one. And that they're responsible for maintaining all balance, harmony, and cosmic laws within the universe. Okay? And so what would you call that though? They're not aliens. They're celestial beings is the best term that I would call them. Okay. That is exactly how ancient cultures call these winged deities. They consider them like celestial creators. And when all the Mesopotamian tablets, all the stories about creation, whether it's the Enuma Elish, the Atrahasis, or all the way through the myth of Adapa or into this region, we find the same thing echoed over and over and over again. Is there some kind of like a celestial creators that come here because it's described that mankind is like a perfect creation of God. That's what it describes.
So God, okay.
And that we were created out of a mold that God created to be a microcosm of the entire macrocosm. And that we are some of the most important beings like in the universe. And we don't know it. We don't understand it. We're far greater than we've ever been told. That our existence here is an existence that is based on free will and destiny both at the same time.
Yeah, maybe that's not the worst thing that we've never been told that.
That we are divine beings that are non-physical at our core, that are having a physical experience as man, and that it describes how man fell in love with its shadow. That's what it says, is that mankind fell in love with its physical existence and forgot about its source existence as a spirit. And that's how we lost ourselves here, is that we became enamored by our own shadow. And that we forgot all about who we are, and that we exist in a place that is highly guarded and balanced by these celestials. That's why I'm so optimistic when I talk to people where they're like, "Oh my God, we're going to blow up the world or we're going to destroy ourselves." We can't.
We can't.
We can't. We're part of a blueprint and a path that has already been predetermined and destined. That we're part of a source. We're essentially.
But what if part of that is you do blow it up at some point to restart?
We can't. That's why during World War II and the Cold War, not World War II, but during the Cold War, there was so many stories of how there was accidental incursions with Soviet Union where they actually went and pushed the button, but it didn't work.
So you think that's celestial divine intervention?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, look. You remember the old studio? I used to have the picture of the offshoot of the hand of God in Adam, but instead of the hand of God in Adam, it had a robot hand, which was the fear of like, oh, what if we get into this AI world where shit gets weird? But right above that, I had the picture of the bomb tested at Bikini Atoll. And I had that there because it was giving me hope for the future, because I looked at that and said, we've had the ability to destroy ourselves in our hands, like little fucking footballs tossed between each other, no pun intended, for the last 80 years, and we haven't done it.
And you know what? We would have. I'm telling you, the more that I've looked at it, the more that I believe that if that intervention didn't occur, we'd already be gone.
So you think it's, well,
and
that's heavy, man.
And so the way it works is that we are God experiencing a physical reality from all archetypes, and that God is everything. Source or God is everything that exists. It's what nature is that it describes that if you want to know what God is just nature. It is all. It's like it's an offhands type of existence where the interactions and the balancing that occurs is based on the celestials creating and maintaining balance here, whereas we are basically like children trying to grow up to realize what we really are, and that every incarnation, every life, we get closer and closer to the divinity of understanding what we are. But we have time periods that occur in history where we go backwards and we completely forget everything. We have to start over.
And time is just relative.
Because you know what it says? Because it says, and Hermes asked about why. How is that possible that we could forget everything and have to start over again? Because it states that cycles dictate everything in the universe. Everything is based on cycles, and that nothing is permanent. Nothing.
And what seems long to us is but a speck of time.
Exactly.
And relative.
Which is how an ancient civilization could have rose up to become literally divine.
Yeah.
And reach the highest states of everything, because that can't exist permanently. They were knocked down to start over again because cycles govern every single thing that exists. Everything must have a high and then a low and then a high and then a low. It's just cycles based on creation and destruction.
That's a heavy combo. We could go a lot deeper on this. That's like a fucking brain melter. But you and I got to record a Patreon episode about your time in Peru and some of the stuff you found there. And I want to make sure we do that before you got to go to the airport. So, Matt, thank you as always for coming back. It's been fun again.
You're welcome,
and I wish
Julian.
you all the luck in the world with this new pending excavation happening in Lake Vaughn. It's really, really cool stuff, man.
Perhaps we're going to discover what we've been looking for a very long time.
Maybe.
And humanity can finally understand an entire different chapter that has been lost, that we've forgotten, that we are made to put back together again now.
Would be pretty cool, brother. Well, thank you as always, and we'll have your links down in the description below. Everyone go subscribe to Matt's channel, check out his Instagram, and until next time, brother.
Thanks, Julian.
All right, everybody else, you know what it is. Give it a thought. Get back to me. Peace. Thank you guys for watching the episode. If you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button and smash that like button on the video. They're both a huge, huge help. And if you would like to follow me on Instagram and X, those links are in my description below.